Skyrim gives you the option to marry around 30 different characters, and most players just grab whoever happens to be closest to them without a second thought, but dig into their individual stories, and the lore gets genuinely surprising. So quick note before we start, I put this video together because I kept noticing that most Skyrim marriage content either stops at "here is where to find her," or it leans so hard into mechanics that it forgets there are actual stories attached to these people. I wanted something in between. What I tried to do was take each marriageable woman in the game, trace what the lore actually tells us about her life before the Dragonborn showed up, and then rank all of them in a way that accounts for that context rather than just who hits the hardest in a fight. One deliberate choice I made in assembling this was to go from the least discussed to the most well-known. So if you've watched a lot of Skyrim content and you're already very familiar with Aela and Lydia, you won't hear those names for a long time. That was intentional. I thought it was a more interesting journey. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. All right, let's get into it. Rank 24. Grelka. Grelka is a Nord woman who runs a market stall in Riften, and that is the entire extent of what most players know about her. She sells light armor at her stall in the Riften market, she offers light armor training at an advanced level, and she is available as a marriage candidate if you are wearing an Amulet of Mara. That is roughly the summary you would find on most wikis, and it is technically accurate, but it misses some of the texture the game gives her if you actually take the time to speak with her at any length. Grelka is not a warm person. She doesn't pretend to be, which is at least consistent. There is an abrasiveness to her dialogue that sets her apart from the other vendors in the Riften market, and it is not merely a personality quirk floating in isolation. When you speak with her, she makes it clear almost immediately that she has little patience for people who approach her hoping for pleasantries. She will tell you her prices are her prices. She is not interested in negotiating. She is not interested in hearing your story. She wants to complete the transaction and move on. Some players find this off-putting, and in isolation, it could read as the game just writing a rude character for the sake of variety. But if you dig into the broader context of Riften as a city and think seriously about what it would actually mean to operate an independent business there, her attitude starts to look less like a personality flaw and more like a reasonable adaptation to an unreasonable environment. Riften is a city fundamentally defined by corruption. The Blackbriar family has the city guard functionally in their pocket. The Thieves Guild maintains a criminal infrastructure that runs under almost every economic transaction in the city. Maven Blackbriar functions as an untouchable power broker who operates behind the law rather than under it, and the Jarl's court is compromised enough that challenging any of this through official channels is essentially pointless. For a small independent merchant like Grelka, operating a stall there without political connections or guild backing is a daily exercise in stubbornness. She doesn't have the Blackbriar name. She doesn't have a guild contract protecting her. She's just a woman with some leather armor and an extremely firm position on her own pricing, surviving in a marketplace where the people around her are systematically more powerful than she is. When you understand that, the edge in her voice takes on a different character. It is the edge of someone who has learned, possibly the hard way, that being open and trusting in Riften is not a strategy that pays off. She has closed herself off not because she was born disagreeable, but because the city around her has given her reliable evidence that openness is a vulnerability she cannot afford. There is something else in her dialogue that points toward a harder history than her current situation explicitly reveals. The way she talks about trust and business dealings carries a weight that doesn't quite fit someone who is simply mildly cynical by nature. It reads more like someone who has been burned before, not in a vague or general sense, but specifically the way a person speaks when they are referencing a particular lesson they paid a real price to learn. One possible reading of Grelka is that she came to Riften at some point, with some expectation of opportunity, found something considerably darker waiting for her, and recalibrated her entire approach to human interaction in response to that discovery. Her skill as an armor trainer is worth pausing on. Most of Skyrim's light armor trainers are hunters, scouts, or people with a background in some form of active outdoor life that required practical protection. Grelka doesn't obviously fit any of those categories based on what the surface of her character shows. She is a market vendor, and yet she has expert-level knowledge of how light armor works, how to wear it effectively, and presumably how to maintain it. That knowledge had to come from somewhere. It implies a past that involved more physical danger than her current role behind a market stall would suggest, whether that was a previous life as a hunter, a period of military or mercenary work, or simply the result of surviving Riften's underground violence in some more direct capacity than she currently experiences. The game doesn't say. It's one of those details that points clearly toward a fuller history while deliberately withholding it. As a wife, Grelka brings the same direct practicality to domestic life that she brings to everything else. She sets up as a shopkeeper in your home. She provides income. She keeps things running. She does not perform warmth she doesn't feel, which in its own way is a form of respect. She is not going to tell you what you want to hear. She is going to tell you what she actually thinks, which means when she does express anything resembling affection, it carries a credibility that more openly warm characters sometimes don't have. She ranks at the bottom of this list not as a judgment of her worth as a character, but as a reflection of what the game actually gives you to work with. She is thinly written in the sense that her story is mostly implied rather than stated, and the game never provides enough material to properly develop what those implications suggest. There is potentially a very interesting character in Grelka. The game just didn't take the time to write her, which is a different kind of problem than being poorly conceived, but it still results in a ranking that reflects the overall thinness of the portrait. If you are the kind of player who wants a spouse who will mind their own business, run a functional shop, and not follow you around the house asking questions, Grelka is a perfectly reasonable choice. She is competent, she is consistent, and she is exactly who she presents herself as being. Those are not small things. They are just not enough on their own to rank higher than this. Rank 23. Gilfrey. Gilfrey is a Nord woman living and working at Mixwater Mill, a lumber operation situated in the East March region of Skyrim, not far from the city of Windhelm. She is one of the most geographically isolated, marriageable NPCs in the entire game, which almost certainly accounts for why she comes up so rarely in any discussion of Skyrim's marriage system. Players typically have to go deliberately out of their way to encounter her, and the area around Mixwater Mill doesn't have enough quest activity pulling people in that direction to make her a frequent, accidental discovery. Mixwater Mill is a modest operation by any measure. There's the mill itself, a main living structure, and a small group of workers who handle the day-to-day physical labour. What the game doesn't make a big deal about, but which is genuinely worth highlighting, is the fact that Gilfrey owns and manages the entire operation. She's not an employee, she's not a worker among workers, she is running a business, she is managing people, she is handling the logistics of a lumber trade operation in a province that, at the time of the game's events, is actively engaged in a civil war. That last detail matters more than it might initially seem. Getting wood harvested, prepared, and delivered to buyers during the Skyrim Civil War is not a trivial logistical challenge. Military movements disrupt trade routes. Soldiers commandeer resources. Political instability creates uncertainty about who your buyers will be in 6 months, and whether the roads they'd need to travel will be safe. Gilfrey is navigating all of this, presumably without a political patron backing her, without guild connections, and without any apparent outside support. The fact that Mixwater Mill is still operating at all when you arrive there is its own quiet form of competence. She has a minor miscellaneous quest she can give you, involving recovering some goods that have been stolen from the mill. It is a brief errand, the kind you could complete in 10 minutes, without much effort, but it does something important. It tells you that people steal from her, that she doesn't have the resources to prevent it or respond to it on her own. She's running a business that is vulnerable enough to petty theft that she needs to ask a passing traveller for help. And she does ask. She doesn't pretend it's not a problem. There's a pragmatism in that which is consistent with everything else the game establishes about her. Gilfra's general demeanour is notably quieter than some of the other women on this list. She doesn't carry the argumentative edge of Grelka or the suspicious quality of some of the Riften-adjacent characters. She has found a rhythm to her life, and she is working to maintain it. There is something almost meditative about the existence the game places her in. The daily activity of running a lumber operation, the physical work of it, the management of workers and materials, and the ongoing practical problem of keeping a business functioning. It is not glamorous life by any stretch, but it has a texture to it that feels genuinely lived in. What the game leaves entirely open is how Gilfra came to be at Mixwater Mill in the first place. The mill is named Mixwater Mill, not after her, which suggests that either the name predates her ownership, or that she simply didn't name it after herself. Either way, she didn't build it in the sense of naming it her own. This raises the question of how she acquired ownership. Inheritance is one possibility, which would imply a family history connected to the property. Purchase is another, which implies she had resources and a plan at some earlier point in her life. The game doesn't say, and that silence leaves a significant portion of her character as pure inference. As a wife, she is quiet and present, without being demanding. She doesn't bring drama. She sets up the expected shop function. She says the expected things. She's not a spectacular choice, but she's not a bad one. The isolation of her life before marriage suggests that domesticity with a partner might actually mean more to her than the game's minimal dialogue is able to express. But that is inference rather than fact. She ranks one above Grelka primarily because something about the totality of her situation, the isolation, the ownership, the quiet competence in an out-of-the-way place, feels slightly more developed, even if it is also less explicitly stated. There is a life there. The game just drew it in very faint lines. Rank 22. Aerie. Aerie is another Nordwoman connected to the lumber industry, which at this point in the list is beginning to feel like a pattern. She lives and works at Anger's Mill, a small lumber operation in the Pale, and she becomes available as a marriage candidate after you agree to chop some wood for her. This is either an admirably practical approach to establishing mutual usefulness in a relationship, or one of the least romantic marriage prerequisites in a game full of mildly strange marriage prerequisites, depending on how charitably you're reading it. Anger's Mill is located in a part of the Pale that is not exactly notable for being welcoming. The Pale is one of Skyrim's colder and more exposed holds, a region of open tundra and rocky terrain where the winters are severe even by Skyrim standards. There are no significant cities nearby, no major trade routes passing through, and the general geographic character of the area is one of vast, cold openness that the settlements in it have learned to live within rather than overcome. Running a lumber mill in this environment is a specific kind of hard. The winters are long. The work is physically demanding at the best of times. The isolation is structural. It is built into the geography, and there is no solving it through effort or ingenuity. You simply live in a place where the nearest city is a significant distance away, and the weather will try to kill you if you give it the opportunity. Aerie has some combat competence, which is worth noting because it distinguishes her from the purely civilian characters at the bottom of this list. She is not a trained warrior, but she can fight, and she will, if necessary. This is consistent with the life she leads. Someone doing physical labor alone in an isolated region of one of Skyrim's harsher holds does not have the luxury of being entirely helpless in dangerous situations. Skyrim's wilderness is full of bandits, wolves, saber-cats, and other things that will take advantage of vulnerability. Aerie's ability to defend herself is probably the product of practical necessity rather than any deliberate martial training. The name of the mill, Anger's Mill, is a small but interesting detail. It carries the name of someone who is not currently there. Anger, whoever that was, is either dead, gone, or simply a previous owner whose name stuck to the property after they left. Aerie may have inherited the operation from Anger, may have purchased it, or may have come to work there under a previous owner and eventually taken over. The game leaves all of this open. What the name does establish is that the mill has a history that predates Aerie's involvement with it, which gives her situation a slightly different texture than if she was simply operating a nameless mill she'd built herself. Her availability condition, the wood chopping, is mechanically interesting as a marriage gate because it frames the initial relationship between player and character in terms of practical contribution rather than heroism or quest completion. She doesn't need you to kill a dragon for her, she needs wood cut. That is a grounded request, and in a game where most of the drama is apocalyptic in scale, there is something oddly refreshing about a character who just wants a practical task done, and responds to that with enough warmth to consider letting you into her life. As a wife, Aerie is similar in most respects to Gilfra. She manages the shop, she provides income, she keeps to herself when you're out adventuring. The specific context of the Pale gives her a slightly different colouring in that the place she comes from is genuinely harsh, and there is an implied toughness in that background, even if the game doesn't make a big deal of it. She sits one step above Gilfrey primarily on the basis of the combat capability and the slightly more explicit hardness of her geographic context. Both of those details point towards someone who has been shaped by a genuinely difficult environment, and that shaping implies a character with more substance than the dialogue alone communicates. Rank 21. Injada Stonearm. Injada Stonearm is a member of the Companions, the warrior guild based out of Whiterun's Jorvaska, and the organisational context of her character immediately places her in a much more visible category than the three lumberworkers we've just discussed. The Companions are one of the four major joinable factions in the base game, sitting alongside the Thieves Guild, the Dark Brotherhood, and the College of Winterhold. Being a companion means Injada comes with a built-in world, an institution with history and culture, and internal politics that gives her a framework even before the game tells you anything specific about her as a person. The Companion's institutional history is one of the richer lore threads in Skyrim's base game. They trace their origins back to Ysgramor and the original 500 Companions who crossed from Atmora to Tamriel in the ancient past, the same group who drove the Snow Elves from Skyrim after the Merethic-era massacre at Sarthul. The current iteration of the organisation is considerably more modest than those legendary warriors, a freelance mercenary and warrior guild rather than a conquering force. But the myth of those origins is very much alive in how Companions members understand their own legacy. They are, in their own telling, heirs to something enormous, even if the everyday reality of the job involves killing giants and escorting merchants. Jorvaska itself is worth a brief mention because it shapes the environment Injada has developed in. It is one of the oldest buildings in Skyrim, a mead hall built by one of the original Companions of Ysgramor, and reputed to have been constructed facing the direction of Atmora, the lost homeland of the ancient Nords. It is both a functional headquarters and a living museum of Nord warrior culture. People who train and live and eat and drink within those walls are absorbing a specific set of values and a specific understanding of what strength means and what it's for, and that absorption is apparent in almost every companion you speak to. Njada fits this culture with a precision that is almost total. She is blunt. She is direct. She measures people against an internal standard she doesn't hide. When you talk to her before establishing yourself within the companions, she is not unfriendly exactly, but she is assessing. She is figuring out whether you're worth her time. She doesn't perform warmth she hasn't concluded you've earned, which is consistent with the companions' general cultural sensibility around merit. In the companions, you demonstrate your worth or you don't. The organization is not interested in people who claim capability without backing it up. Her social position within the organization is an interesting element that the game handles obliquely. The companions are divided between the inner circle, the senior trusted members, and the more general membership of the whelps. Njada is not in the circle when the game begins. This places her in the same organizational tier as the player character, someone who is clearly capable but who has not yet achieved the full trust and recognition of the institution's senior members. That position involves a specific psychological dynamic. She knows she is good. She knows she has not yet been formally acknowledged as one of the best, and she watches everyone around her, including the player, with the careful attention of someone who is always quietly running that internal comparison. Her role as a block trainer is genuinely interesting from a character standpoint. Blocking, as a combat skill, requires a different kind of thinking than offensive weapons work. You are not simply hitting things as hard as you can. You are reading timing, positioning, telegraphing. You are making yourself a wall and understanding how to angle that wall to redirect rather than simply absorb force. Teaching this skill implies that Njada has a strategic intelligence that the companion's reputation for direct, uncomplicated violence doesn't always foreground. She understands the defensive game as well as, or better than she understands, the offensive one. Her romance availability is unlocked simply by being a companion in good standing and wearing the amulet of Mara. There is no separate personal quest, no specific task connected to her. She becomes available when you're recognized by the institution she's part of, which in its own way is consistent with her character. She is not going to marry someone who isn't a companion. She is not going to lower her standards for someone who shows up without having proven themselves in the context she respects most. As a wife, Njada brings the same directness she brings to everything else. She is not going to soften dramatically after marriage. She expresses affection in the same tone she expresses opinions about shield techniques. There is a specific kind of reliability in this that some players find cold and others find genuinely comfortable. She is always going to be who she is. There is no performance, no recalibration for domestic life. She is a warrior who happens to also be your wife. She ranks 21 because despite the richness of the companion's context, the game ultimately doesn't do much with Njada's specific story within it. She has a personality, which many characters don't, but she doesn't have a history that the player gets to access. She is a compelling sketch rather than a complete portrait. Rank 20. Orla. Orla is a priestess of Dibella, serving at the Temple of Dibella in Markarth. Dibella is the divine of beauty, love, art and human dignity, and the faith organized around her is one of the more thoughtfully portrayed religions in the base game. Most of Skyrim's religious content is functional rather than genuinely exploratory, giving you enough flavor to feel like the world has spiritual depth without committing to much theological detail. The Temple of Dibella in Markarth is an exception. It has its own questline, its own internal hierarchy, its own mysteries and rituals, and a treatment of the Dibellan faith that takes it seriously enough to generate genuine interest. The faith of Dibella, as the game portrays it, is not simply about beauty in the aesthetic sense. It encompasses love and physical intimacy in a way that Nordic society generally approaches with some discomfort, which makes the temple a slightly complicated institution within Markarth's social landscape. The priestesses serve as keepers of this tradition, which involves both the practical maintenance of the temple and participation in devotional rites that the general public is not privy to. The inner sanctum of the temple is closed to outsiders. Something sacred happens there. The specifics are deliberately withheld, which gives the faith a mystery cult quality that makes all of its priestesses slightly more interesting than they might otherwise be. Orla is one of the supporting priestesses, not the senior figure of the order, which positions her as someone whose life is organized around service and devotion rather than administrative authority. Her job is to maintain the temple, to participate in the rituals, to serve the Sibyl of Dibella when one is in residence, and to embody the values of the faith in how she moves through the world. The Sibyl is the child chosen by Dibella herself to serve as a kind of earthly vessel for the divine's presence, and the quest line associated with the temple, called the Heart of Dibella, involves finding a new Sibyl after the previous one has passed. The Heart of Dibella is a well-constructed minor quest line that treats its subject with more respect than most optional quests in the game. It takes the religion seriously. It asks you to engage with a community that has genuine beliefs and genuine grief over the loss of their Sibyl, and the process of finding and returning the new one is handled with appropriate weight. This is the quest line through which Orla's marriage availability is unlocked. The connection between completing this quest and being able to marry Orla is not a mechanical coincidence. It is character consistent. Orla is a woman whose life is organized around her community and her faith. She is not going to become romantically interested in someone who has no demonstrated connection to those things. By completing the Heart of Dibella, you have done something that matters in her world. You have contributed to the continuity of something she has devoted her life to protecting. That is a meaningful basis for regard. Her personality is warm without being effusive. She has the settled quality of someone who has found something genuinely meaningful to organize her life around and has done so with full commitment. She is not performing devotion. She is not going through motions. The faith she follows is actually alive in how she speaks and carries herself, which is a relatively rare quality in game characters whose religious affiliation is usually more set dressing than character substance. The Markarth setting adds background texture, even when it doesn't directly touch Orla. Markarth is a complicated city. It is built on the ruins of a Dwemer city, which gives it an architectural character unlike anywhere else in Skyrim, all stone and ancient machinery, and the specific atmosphere of inhabiting something built by a civilization that disappeared so completely that their purpose and internal experience remain largely beyond understanding. The city's political history is also deeply troubled, involving the Forsworn, the Reachman natives who were displaced from their homeland, the violence that accompanied that displacement, and a contemporary political situation defined by the Silverblood family's power and the prison system at Sidna Mine, which has at various points operated as something very close to a forced labour camp. In this environment, the Temple of Dibella functions as a place slightly outside the main currents of political struggle. It is sacred ground in a city that is otherwise very much defined by who has power over whom. Orla's life within the temple is, in a meaningful sense, a kind of sanctuary, a daily practice of attending to something that the surrounding political world can't easily touch. As a wife, she brings that quality of settled warmth into the home. She is not dramatic. She does not carry baggage that erupts unexpectedly. She is who she is consistently, and she brings that consistency with her. Marriage to Orla is quiet in the best sense of that word. It is the quietness of a person who has made peace with where they are and what they value, and who extends that peace to the people they share their life with. She ranks 20th because the game's character work on her is genuine, but incomplete. She's well drawn within a narrow frame, and that frame is interesting, but she doesn't have a personal history that extends beyond the temple. She is fully present in the moment the game places her in and largely still beyond it. Rank 19. Hroki. Hroki occupies an unusual space in this discussion because she is technically flagged in the game's data as a marriageable character, but in practice, the standard path to marriage doesn't function with her under normal gameplay conditions. She is one of those cases where the game's development process appears to have left something in an incomplete or inconsistent state, which in a project of Skyrim's scale and complexity is not exactly surprising. Large games accumulate these kinds of inconsistencies almost inevitably. She lives in Markarth, the daughter of Klepper, the innkeeper of the Silverblood Inn. Her presence in the game is primarily as a background character within that establishment, one of the NPCs who exists to populate the space and make it feel like people actually live and work in it. She helps around the inn, she has her own dialogue, and she carries herself with enough specificity that it's clear the writers had some sense of who she was when they created her. The problem is that whatever mechanism was supposed to allow the player to marry her was either never completed or was removed before the final game shipped. What makes Hroki interesting as a character, despite this limitation, is the environment she's grown up in. The Silverblood Inn in Markarth is not simply a tavern, it is an institution that carries the name of the Silverblood family, Markarth's most powerful and politically connected noble house. The Silverbloods own Sidna Mine. They have significant influence over the Jarl's court. They are, in various ways that the game makes fairly explicit, the kind of family whose name on a building means something about what goes on inside it and who feels welcome there. Growing up as the daughter of the innkeeper in this establishment means growing up embedded in a specific social world. The people who pass through the Silverblood Inn are not random travellers staying one night. They are the merchants and political figures and connected individuals who move through Markarth's power structure. Hroki has spent her formative years watching these people, listening to their conversations, observing how power works in this city at a ground level that most of the city's residents never access. Markarth's broader context, as noted in Orla's section, is one of deep and layered political complexity. The Reachmen and their relationship to the land predating the current Nord occupation. The Forsworn insurgency that treats the entire current political order of the Reach as an occupation worth violently opposing. The Silverblood family's control of the city's economic infrastructure. The prison system at Sidna Mine. All of this is the background against which Hroki's life has taken shape, and the result is someone who has been exposed to a level of political complexity that most NPCs of her apparent age and station haven't encountered. She ranks here specifically to acknowledge the unusual situation she occupies. As a character concept, she has genuine interest. The setting, the family context, the exposure to Markarth's political world, all of it points towards someone who could be a compelling marriage candidate with sufficient development. The technical reality of her situation, the fact that she cannot actually be married through normal gameplay, means she functions as an interesting near miss, rather than a complete entry in the marriage roster. She is worth knowing about, and she is worth understanding in the context of what she suggests about the game's development process, but she cannot be fully evaluated as a wife, because the game ultimately does not allow you to marry her. Rank 18, Uthgerd the Unbroken. Uthgerd the Unbroken is a Nord warrior who spends her time at the Bannered Mare Tavern in Whiterun. She is one of the most accessible potential companions and wives in the early game simply by virtue of being in one of the first cities most players reach during a standard playthrough, and her personality announces itself within about 15 seconds of beginning a conversation with her. She is confrontational, she is proud, she has very specific ideas about what strength means and how it should be demonstrated, and she communicates all of this without any particular hesitation or concern for how it lands. The way you unlock her as a companion and potential wife is through a brawl. You fight her hand to hand in the tavern. No weapons, and if you win, she decides you're worth her time. This is one of those game mechanics that could read as gratuitous, but it is actually one of the more internally consistent marriage prerequisites in the game. Uthgerd's entire value system is built around the idea that strength is the meaningful currency of a person's worth, and that it should be tested rather than simply claimed. The idea that she would extend her trust and companionship to someone who couldn't pass a direct physical test would be character inconsistent. The brawl is not a quirk, it is her worldview made mechanical. Her backstory is one of the more quietly affecting on this list. When she was a child, she wanted to join the companions. This was not a casual interest. She trained for it. She worked toward it with the kind of commitment that a young person brings to a dream that has organized their entire sense of what they want their life to become. And then, during the ritual hazing that initiates new whelps into the companions, she killed a boy. The game is explicit that it was an accident. She struck too hard. She didn't intend to kill anyone, but a boy died and the consequence was total. The companions turned her away. She was not admitted. This is the wound at the centre of Uthgerd's character, and it is one that the game handles with more delicacy than the surface belligerence might suggest. Being rejected by the companions is not a minor professional setback in the context of Nord warrior culture. The companions are one of the most significant institutions in that cultural landscape. They trace their history back to Hisgramor. They are housed in one of Skyrim's oldest buildings. They represent a specific ideal of what Nord warrior identity looks like at its most honoured. Being told you cannot be part of that, especially for an accident, especially when you're a child who made a terrible mistake while trying to demonstrate precisely the strength the companions are supposed to value, is a wound to the self that doesn't easily heal. Uthgerd has been carrying this for years. The name she goes by, Uthgerd the Unbroken, is a declaration, a statement she's been making to the world and to herself about how she has responded to everything that happened. She was rejected. She killed someone by accident and bore the consequences alone. She rebuilt a life without the institutional home she wanted. And she is still here. She is unbroken. Whether the title is accurate or is itself a kind of performance of resilience, the game leaves open, and that ambiguity gives it more weight than it would have if it were simply straightforward. The Bannered Mare is an interesting place for someone with her history to be. It is a social space, not a warrior's institution. She is not training. She is not on patrol. She is sitting in a tavern, drinking, and occasionally picking fights with travellers who seem like they might be able to take a punch. It is not the life she planned. It is not the life she wanted. And she has apparently decided to keep going anyway. As a follower, Uthgerd is genuinely solid. She's a capable fighter, she handles herself well in challenging situations, and she has the practical durability that comes from someone who's been taking care of herself without organisational support for a long time. She does not require coddling. She does not need to be talked through danger. She is going to do what needs to be done and not make a production of it. As a wife, she carries all of this into domestic life without pretending to be someone she isn't. She is direct, she is steady, and she has this specific warmth of someone who has been alone for long enough that companionship, real companionship, means something to her that it might not mean to someone whose life had been easier. There is an affection beneath the directness that you only see if you stay long enough to be worth showing it to. She ranks 18 because the wound at her centre, the boy, the rejection, the years of sitting in a tavern rebuilding an identity without the institution that should have held it, is genuinely interesting and genuinely affecting, but the game introduces it and then mostly leaves it alone. There is a richer story here than the game takes the time to tell, and that unfulfilled potential keeps her from ranking higher, despite the real emotional weight of what is actually there. Rank 17. Borgak the Steel Heart. Borgak the Steel Heart is an Orsimer woman living at Mor Kazga, one of the orc strongholds located in the Reach. She is the daughter of the stronghold's chief, which places her in a specific and carefully defined social position within Orsimer culture. That position is simultaneously privileged and constrained in ways that the game points toward but doesn't fully articulate, and understanding those ways is essential to understanding who Borgak actually is. Orsimer culture, as Skyrim portrays it, is organized around a set of social structures that feel, from an outside perspective, extremely rigid. The strongholds are each led by a chief who has achieved his position through combat, traditionally by defeating or killing the previous chief. This chief has the right, within the cultural framework, to take the stronghold's women as wives and to manage the major decisions of the community's life. Men who are not the chief are expected to either serve him or to leave and prove themselves capable of founding or taking their own stronghold. Women are expected to serve the community in specific roles, with their marital futures managed by the chief rather than by their own preferences. This is the formal structure. The actual texture of how people experience it is, as is usually the case with any cultural system, more complicated. The Orsimer NPCs you meet throughout Skyrim don't uniformly experience their culture as oppressive in the way an outside observer might frame it. They have their own pride, their own sense of identity, their own understanding of why the system exists and what it provides. Malakath, the Daedric prince that the stronghold orcs follow, has his own code of honor that informs these structures, and many Orsimer genuinely find meaning in it. Borgak, however, is not at peace with her assigned future. When you speak to her, she tells you directly that she's been arranged to go to another stronghold as part of a diplomatic arrangement her father has made, and she is not happy about it. She does not want to go. She does not see why the trajectory of her life should be determined by the political calculations of someone else, even if that someone else is her father and the chief of her community. She voices this dissatisfaction plainly, without dressing it up or performing acceptance she doesn't feel. This is one of the more politically interesting character setups in the entire marriage system. Borgak is a woman who exists within a culture that has clear and specific expectations for her, and those expectations conflict directly with her own sense of what she wants. She is not passive about this conflict. She is not quietly suffering. She is willing to say out loud that she wants something different, and when the player character presents the option of marriage to you as an alternative to the arranged departure, she can accept it. The mechanism through which this happens is itself worth examining. You can either persuade her father to release her from the arranged departure, or you can pay a small sum of gold to compensate the stronghold for the diplomatic value they're losing. The gold transaction sits somewhat uncomfortably when you examine it, because on a direct reading it is a man buying a woman from her father. The more charitable interpretation frames it as compensation for the political arrangement that is being disrupted and recognizes that Borgak is an active participant in the decision to leave. Both readings have legitimacy, and the game's deliberate choice not to resolve the tension between them is either thoughtful or oversight, depending on how generously you're reading the writers. What is not ambiguous is Borgak's own will in the situation. She chooses to leave. She is not coerced. The question of whether the broader system around that choice respects her agency in a full and meaningful way is complicated, but the choice itself is hers. Her personality is exactly what you would expect from someone who has grown up in an orc stronghold and spent her life chafing against institutional expectations. She is tough. She is direct. She doesn't have patience for people who can't demonstrate their worth in practical terms. As a follower, she is a capable, heavy-hitting companion who functions well in the kind of frontal combat that orc warrior culture tends to favour. One possible reading of Borgak that the game points toward but doesn't pursue is about the question of belonging after leaving, She has walked away from her community, from the stronghold, from the culture that formed her. She is going into a world that, as an orc woman, will not always treat her well. Orcsimer face significant racial prejudice throughout Skyrim. Some cities actively restrict their entry. The wider world she is entering by marrying the player character is not a welcoming one, and she is doing it without the support of the community she grew up in. What that costs her and whether the marriage compensates for that cost is something the game gestures at without exploring. She ranks 17 because her setup is among the most conceptually interesting in the marriage pool, combining cultural commentary, personal agency, and a backstory with genuine political texture. The execution leaves much of that potential unrealized, but the foundation suggests a character who could support a much more developed story than the game ultimately tells. Rank 16. Senna. Senna is another priestess of Dibella at the Temple of Dibella in Markarth. She serves in a role similar to Orla's, but carries herself differently, and the distinction between them is worth drawing carefully because it speaks to how well built the temple's ensemble actually is. Where Orla has the quality of deep settled devotion, a kind of quiet spiritual gravity that makes her feel like she's been exactly where she is for a very long time, Senna comes across as more practically engaged. She's warmer on the surface, more willing to meet a stranger partway, more openly curious about the people she interacts with. She has a wit to her that Orla doesn't quite share, a lightness that suggests someone who has found genuine joy in what she does rather than simply purpose. There is a difference between fulfillment and contentment, and Senna's specific register sits closer to fulfillment. She is active in it. She is present in it. The Temple of Dibella's mystery cult aspects, the closed inner sanctum, the rituals not open to the public, the specific devotional practices of the Dibellan faith that the game only partially illuminates, give all of the priestesses a slightly hidden quality. They are part of something that the rest of the world doesn't fully have access to, and that participation in private knowledge shapes how they move through the public world. Senna, perhaps more than Orla, seems comfortable with this quality of partial concealment. She can be warm and accessible in conversation without betraying anything about what goes on inside the temple's private spaces. She's made her peace with existing in both registers simultaneously. Her marriage availability is also tied to the completion of the Heart of Dibella questline, the same gate that applies to Orla. This is a sensible design choice. Both women are embedded in the temple community, and both have a faith-based framework for what kinds of people are worth their sustained attention. Completing the quest doesn't just open a mechanical gate, it demonstrates that you take their world seriously enough to act within it, which is precisely what someone like Senna would need to see before she considered a deeper connection. Her Breton background is worth a brief mention because the game doesn't always foreground it, but it does add colour. Bretons are known across Tamriel for a specific relationship with magic, a natural affinity that expresses itself in varying degrees across individuals, and for a cultural sophistication associated with the region of High Rock where most Bretons originate. They are generally understood to be a people who value learning, refinement, and a certain kind of intellectual engagement with the world. How a Breton woman ends up as a priestess of Dibella in Markarth is a story the game doesn't tell, and the gap between High Rock and the Reach is wide enough that there's presumably a journey between them worth knowing about. As a wife, Senna is warm, engaged, and generally pleasant. She doesn't withdraw or become difficult. She manages a shop from your home with the same practical energy she brings to her temple duties. There is nothing about marriage to Senna that is complicated or fraught. She is simply a person who has found her place and is happy to expand that place to include you. She sits one position above Orla in this ranking because of the personality distinction. The game gave her a slightly more specifically drawn voice, a bit more wit, a touch more of the quality that makes you interested in what she'll say next, rather than simply comforted by her presence. In a list where many characters are differentiated by small margins, that specificity is worth one position. Rank 15, Morwen. Morwen is a Nord woman living in Skarl village on Solstheim, which makes her a Dragonborn DLC character. Solstheim is the island setting of the Dragonborn expansion, a land with its own distinct history, culture, and political atmosphere that differs in important ways from mainland Skyrim. Getting there requires a boat from Windhelm, and the journey itself signals that you are entering somewhere genuinely separate, not just a different part of the same map. Skarl village is the home of the Skarl people, a Nord subgroup whose cultural and religious practices have diverged significantly from those of their mainland counterparts over the centuries of relative isolation on the island. The Skarl worship the Allmaker, a spiritual force they understand as the creative source underlying all of existence. Their relationship with nature is animistic and intimate, built around the idea that the world is alive in ways that go beyond the physical. The Allmaker stones, sacred sites scattered across Solstheim, are part of their devotional geography, and the village's spiritual life is organised around these practices in ways that would seem foreign even to devout divines worshippers from the mainland. This cultural background gives Morwen a grounding that is qualitatively different from most of the mainland wives. The Skarl tradition shapes how she understands the world, what she values, and how she relates to her community. She is not simply a Nord woman in a village. She is a Nord woman in a specific cultural tradition that has been maintained through isolation and a sustained commitment to practices that the wider world of Tamriel has largely forgotten or never knew. Morwen has a personal errand she asks you to complete before becoming available for marriage. She wants you to deliver a letter to someone on the mainland, specifically to a woman named Botti in Ivarstead. The letter is from Morwen to Botti, and it concerns a burial, the burial of Morwen's mother Frida in Ivarstead, rather than on Solstheim. It is a small private family matter, the kind of thing that doesn't make it into grand questlines or dramatic confrontations. It is simply a woman arranging something meaningful to her, asking a traveller to carry a message across a body of water because she cannot make the trip herself. This errand functions as an introduction to Morwen's inner life in a way that feels proportionate and genuine. She has a family she grieves. She has connections to the mainland that matter to her. She is not a static figure, isolated on her island, complete and self-contained. She is someone whose life has threads extending outward in multiple directions, and the task of maintaining those threads costs something, requires effort, and means that she is engaged with the world beyond her immediate situation. The Dragonborn DLC context gives Morwen's world additional weight. Solstheim, under the influence of Mirak, the first Dragonborn who's been corrupted by Hermaeus Mora over millennia in Apocrypha, is not a peaceful place during the events of the questline. The island's residents are vulnerable in specific ways, including the Allmaker stones being corrupted, and the population being enslaved to rebuild Mirak's temple. Morwen's community is under genuine threat, and living in the Skarl village during that period requires the same kind of resilience and steadiness that living in any community under threat requires. As a wife, Morwen carries the warmth that Skarl culture seems to emphasize, an openness to community and connection that comes from a way of life built around communal survival and spiritual communion with the world. She is not a dramatic personality. She is not full of sharp edges or surprising depths. She is grounded in a tradition that gives her stability, and that stability comes through in how she presents herself and relates to the people around her. She ranks 15 because the Skarl cultural context elevates her above the characters with thinner world building, even though her personal story is also relatively modest in scale. She feels embedded in something larger than herself, which does significant character work on behalf of a relatively quiet person. Rank 14, Camilla Valerius. Camilla Valerius is an imperial woman living in Riverwood, and she is one of the first potential wives many players encounter simply because of where Riverwood sits in a typical playthrough. Riverwood is almost always the first proper settlement the player reaches after the opening events in Helgen, and the Riverwood Trader, the shop run by Camilla and her brother Lucan, is one of the first businesses a new player is likely to walk into. She is involved in the Golden Claw quest, which is among the very first quests most players take on. The Golden Claw, a Dwemer artifact that unlocks a puzzle door deeper in Bleak Falls Barrow, is stolen from the Riverwood Trader by a thief, and recovering it is a natural early goal. Camilla is attached to this quest not just through her family connection to the shop, but through the specific romantic subplot that has developed around her between two of Riverwood's other residents. Sven is a Nord bard who plays at the Sleeping Giant Inn. Farndal is a Bosmer hunter who lives in Riverwood and regularly goes out into the surrounding wilderness. Both of them are interested in Camilla, and both of them are willing to involve the player character in their rivalry. Each man will ask you to deliver a fake letter purportedly from the other, designed to damage their rival's chances and improve their own. The player can help either of them, can refuse both, or can simply ignore the entire situation and marry Camilla themselves, bypassing the rivalry entirely. This setup is worth examining because it reveals something about how Camilla is positioned in the narrative and how that positioning differs from how she actually functions as a character. Sven and Farndal are constructing a story in which Camilla is the goal, the prize that gets assigned to whichever man performs better in the game of manoeuvring and letter forging. The game frames this as a minor quest with low stakes, but Camilla herself is not really participating in the competition in any meaningful way. She has her own life, her own work in the shop, her own interests and daily concerns. The two men are running a race she didn't sign up for, around a trophy she didn't volunteer to be. This is a more complicated dynamic than the game explicitly acknowledges, and one possible reading of Camilla is that she is simply getting on with her life, while two people around her are more invested in the idea of her than in the reality. She is working in the shop. She is managing her relationship with her brother. She is living in a small Nord village as an imperial transplant, which carries its own social textures, even if the game doesn't make a big deal of it. And two men are writing fake letters about her. Her imperial background in Riverwood is itself interesting lore. Riverwood is a Nord village in the middle of Whiterun Hold, an area with strong traditional Nord cultural identity. The civil war running through the game gives ethnic and political identity more charge than it might have during a more peaceful era. Being an imperial in Riverwood, running a business with your brother in someone else's cultural homeland, implies a degree of adaptability and commercial pragmatism. The Riverwood Trader appears to be modestly successful by local standards, which means Camilla and Lucan have figured out how to be useful to the community in a way that transcends whatever cultural frictions might otherwise exist. As a wife, Camilla is warm, settled, and without drama. She expresses affection with the warmth of someone who chose her person deliberately, rather than accepting an arrangement. Her post-marriage life is quiet and functional. She is a good partner in the domestic sense of that word, attentive and present without being demanding. She ranks 14 because she has actual questline presence, an interesting cultural position as an imperial in a Nord village, and a romantic situation that is more interesting to think about than the game directly invites you to. Her limitations are the limitations of a character the game writes primarily in relation to others, rather than fully on her own terms. Rank 13, Sylgia. Sylgia is a Nord woman living in Shawstone, a small mining community in the Rift. She works as a miner, specifically extracting siltstone, and when you first encounter her, she is dealing with a concrete and ongoing problem. She has injured her back. The injury is significant enough that she cannot currently do the physical labour her livelihood depends on, which means she is stuck in a way that has both practical and emotional dimensions. She also mentions her parents, who live in Darkwater Crossing, a mining settlement some distance away. She hasn't been able to visit them because of the injury, and the separation is clearly weighing on her. This setup does something that many of the wives on this list don't quite manage. It gives Sylgia a specific, grounded, mundane problem that is both credible and human without being dramatic in the adventure narrative sense. She didn't get injured fighting bandits or dragons. She got hurt doing her job. Back injuries are the kind of thing that happens to people who do physical labour, the kind of thing that sits between serious and routine, disrupting a life in ways that are deeply felt even if they're not epic in scale. Her situation is real in a way that resonates differently from characters whose difficulties are tied to quest-level events. The minor quest associated with her reflects this tone. She asks you to deliver a satchel to her parents in Darkwater Crossing and to bring back their reply. It is a small errand. You are serving as a messenger between a woman and her family because the woman can't make the trip herself. The emotional core of it is connection, wanting to reach people you care about when circumstances have made reaching them difficult. When you complete it and return with her parents' response, she is grateful in a way that feels proportionate to what it actually meant to her. This is not a character performing gratitude, because the game has coded that response into the quest completion. It reads like someone whose actual need has been met. Sylgia's life in Shaw's Stone is worth understanding in the context of what that community is and what it values. Shaw's Stone is a mining village, and mining is not peripheral to its identity. It is the identity. The community exists because of the mine. The people in it organise their lives around it. The rhythms of the place are the rhythms of extraction and processing and the economy that emerges from it. Within this context, being a miner is not a lowly occupation. It is the thing this community does, and doing it well is its own form of distinction. One possible reading of Sylgia is that she is one of the most realistically drawn characters in the entire marriage system, not because she is more complex than some of the others, but because the dimensions of her life are more recognizable as dimensions actual people deal with. She has a job. She got hurt at her job. She misses her parents. She is worried about her ability to work and earn and maintain her place in her community. None of those things are extraordinary. All of them are real, and the game treats them with enough seriousness that they register as genuine. Her Rift setting gives her a background in one of Skyrim's more politically complicated holds, the home of Riften and Maven Blackbriar, and the Thieves' Guild, even if Shaw's Stone itself is removed from the centre of those dynamics. Living in the Rift means living in a hold where the political and criminal power structures are unusually intertwined, and where the ordinary residents of smaller settlements exist in a kind of careful adjacency to those structures. Sylgia probably knows this. She has probably navigated it in small ways over the course of her life, even if she's not involved in it directly. As a wife, she is warm, honest, and unpretentious. She brings the same grounded quality to domestic life that she brings to her work and her family relationships. She is not going to suddenly develop a complicated inner life after marriage that was invisible before. She is who she presents herself as being, which in a marriage is actually a significant virtue. She ranks 13 because the realistic grounding of her situation, the care in the quest that introduces it, and the unpretentious human texture of her character make her one of the more thoughtfully designed wives in the system. The game's limitations in following through on that character work are real, but what is actually there is genuinely good. Rank 12. Shavi. Shavi is an Argonian woman living in the Argonian assemblage, just outside Windhelm. The location of her home is the single most important piece of context for understanding who she is and what her daily life actually consists of. The Argonian assemblage is the designated living space for Argonians in Windhelm. It is outside the city walls. It is near the docks. It is a building that exists because Argonians are not permitted to live within Windhelm's walls, a policy enforced by the Jarl Ulfric Stormcloak, and reflecting the broader ethno-nationalist element of the Stormcloak political project. Windhelm is the most explicitly Nord supremacist city in the game, a place where the Dunmer Grey Quarter and the Argonian assemblage are persistent monuments to the idea that some people belong inside the walls and some people don't. This is not a subtle or hidden aspect of Windhelm's character. NPCs comment on it explicitly. There is a conversation you can witness between an Argonian dock worker and a Nord guard that makes the discrimination plain. The Dunmer in the Grey Quarter have their own conversations about it. The situation in Windhelm is one of the more morally unambiguous political portrayals in a game that generally tries to keep its political content more ambiguous. Whatever else is complicated about the Civil War, the conditions in Windhelm are fairly straightforwardly presented as wrong. Xavi lives and works in this environment. She does dock work. She earns her living through physical labour in a port that she is not permitted to live near, in any comfortable or dignified sense. And when you talk to her, she is one of the warmest, most genuinely cheerful characters in the game. She talks about optimism. She is grateful for what she has. She speaks about luck in a way that suggests a deliberate, practiced orientation toward the positive dimensions of a life that has significant negatives structurally built into it. This is worth thinking about carefully. It would be easy, and in fact quite understandable, for a character in Xavi's situation to carry anger, resentment, grief, or bitterness. She has every structural reason to feel those things. She has been pushed outside the walls of the city she lives adjacent to. She performs physically demanding labour for a port that treats her as an outsider. She is living in an empire and a province that, at this particular historical moment, are both engaged in serious conversations about which people deserve full recognition and which don't. And those conversations are not going in a direction that benefits her. And she chooses warmth, or manages it, or has arrived at it through some combination of temperament and deliberate practice that the game doesn't fully explain, but that the character consistently embodies. One possible reading of Xavi is as a portrait of psychological resilience in the face of structural marginalization. A person who has found a way to keep her sense of self and her capacity for connection intact in an environment that is not particularly interested in preserving either. Her quest involves the recovery of a personal item, a locket that was stolen from her. The locket has genuine sentimental value, and its loss was painful in a way that goes beyond the object's material worth. When you return it, her gratitude is the specific gratitude of someone who has gotten something back that they thought was gone. And it is one of those small Skyrim moments that lands harder than its modest scale would suggest. The Argonian lore that sits beneath Xavi's character gives her additional depth by extension. Argonians are a people with a complex relationship to their homeland of Black Marsh and to the Hist, the sentient tree organisms that are deeply entwined with Argonian biology and cultural identity. The Hist connect Argonians to each other and to their cultural continuity in ways that most other races don't have an equivalent for. Being separated from Black Marsh and presumably from Hist connection is a form of cultural displacement that many of the Argonian NPCs in Skyrim carry without necessarily articulating it. Xavi in Windhelm, outside the walls of a city that doesn't want her, potentially isolated from the Hist that would give her a different kind of grounding, is carrying more than her dialogue explicitly expresses. As a wife, Xavi is exceptional in terms of what it is like to come home to her. She is warm, she is genuinely glad to see you, and she brings a lightness to domestic life that almost none of the other wives on this list can match. If the sole criterion for ranking with the quality of the emotional experience of being married to this person, Shavi would be near the very top. She ranks 12 overall because the wonderful personality is accompanied by relatively underdeveloped backstory and lore engagement. The game gives you the warmth without fully interrogating the conditions that made the warmth so resilient, and that gap between the character's surface and the depth she implies keeps her from ranking higher, despite the genuine excellence of her presence. Rank 11. Isolde. Isolde is a Nord woman living in Whiterun with a clearly articulated professional dream. She wants to be a merchant. Specifically, she wants to own and operate the Bannered Mare Whiterun's Tavern, which is currently run by Hulda. She has a timeline in mind. She is working toward it, and the strategy she has developed to get there involves building relationships with the Khajiit caravans that travel the roads of Skyrim, learning their trade practices and business methods because she believes that knowledge will give her a competitive edge once she is running her own establishment. This is a rare thing in the landscape of Skyrim's NPC characterization, a character defined not only by who she is right now, but by who she is working to become, with a specific goal, a specific plan, and a specific reason for that plan. Most NPCs in Skyrim are what they are. The blacksmith is a blacksmith. The innkeeper is an innkeeper. Their identity is fixed in the present tense. Isolde is reaching forward, and that orientation toward the future gives her a different texture from nearly everyone else in the marriage pool. The Khajiit connection is worth understanding in some depth because Isolde's choice of trade partners is not the obvious or conventional one. The Khajiit caravans in Skyrim are not permitted inside the cities. They camp outside the gates of the major settlements and conduct their trade from those camps, which means they are the Skyrim equivalent of travelling merchants operating at the edge of a market that doesn't fully want them inside. They carry unusual goods. They have a reputation, somewhat deserved and somewhat the product of racial prejudice, for selling substances that fall outside the boundaries of mainstream trade. They are regarded with varying degrees of suspicion by the Nord population. Isolde's interest in learning from them is deliberately against the grain of Whiterun's conventional social wisdom. She is not seeking out the most respectable trade mentors available to her. She is going to the people who have been pushed to the margins of the market because she thinks they know things that the mainstream doesn't. That is a commercially savvy instinct, but it is also an instinct that requires a certain social confidence. She is willing to associate herself with people her peers might look down on because she has made a judgment about where the valuable knowledge actually lives. The minor quest involving getting a mammoth tusk for her, which she needs for a business dealing she's working on with the Khajiit, makes this concrete in a way that works well. She is not passively waiting for her life to develop in the right direction. She is making specific moves towards specific goals. The mammoth tusk is a material expression of active ambition. She needs something unusual and difficult to obtain for a business relationship she is actively cultivating. You getting it for her is participation in her project, which is a better foundation for a relationship than most of the prerequisites the game offers. Her background as a Nord woman in Whiterun suggests she grew up in or around the city, though the game doesn't provide specifics. What is notable is that her orientation is distinctly commercial rather than martial, which in a Nord cultural context is not always the default. Whiterun honours warriors. It houses the companions. The entire cultural gravity of the city, like most of Skyrim, leans toward the warrior ideal as the primary vehicle for personal distinction. Isolde knows this and doesn't share the value system. She wants to build a business. She is comfortable being the person in the room who is thinking about trade routes, while everyone else is thinking about battles. There is a friendship thread in Isolde's life that extends beyond the borders of her immediate situation and connects her to someone in Riften. Svanna Farshield, a young woman who works at Helga's bunkhouse in Riften, appears to be a friend of Isolde's. Svanna is in a complicated and fairly clearly unhealthy situation with her employer and aunt, Helga. The existence of this connection points toward Isolde as someone who maintains relationships with people outside her immediate community, who cares about people beyond her day-to-day social circle, and who is embedded in a network of relationships that extends outward, from Whiterun in ways the game only partially illuminates. As a wife, Isolde is warm, genuinely enthusiastic, and commercially capable. She sets up a shop, she manages it well, and she brings a livelier quality to domestic life than many of the more reserved women on this list. There is an energy to her that comes from someone who is genuinely motivated by their sense of what they're working toward, and that energy translates into a presence that feels alive rather than static. She ranks 11 because the combination of active ambition, commercial intelligence, cultural openness, genuine warmth, and a specific articulated future she is working toward makes her one of the more fully conceived characters in the marriage pool. Her limitations are structural. The game doesn't resolve the question of her dream, whether she eventually gets the bannered mare, and what happens to her ambition after marriage is simply not addressed. But the foundation is strong enough to make her one of the better written wives in the game. Rank 10. Janassa. Janassa is a Dunmer mercenary who can be hired from the Drunken Huntsman in Whiterun. She is available both as a follower for hire and after you've hired her as a potential wife. Her accessibility early in a typical playthrough means many players encounter her before most of the other women on this list, and her distinctive personality tends to make an impression when they do. She has what might be described as a specifically dark aesthetic sensibility, by which I mean she is openly comfortable with violence, with danger, and with the moral ambiguity that a professional mercenary life involves. She doesn't dress this up. She doesn't apologize for it. She has been in the business of selling her combat skills to whoever can pay for them, and she has made a kind of peace with what that means about how she relates to the more conventional moral frameworks other people bring to situations. This is not performed edginess. It is consistent. She speaks about what she finds interesting and what she values with the same directness throughout. And what she finds interesting is the hunt, the fight, and the professional execution of dangerous tasks. The mercenary profession in Skyrim's world occupies a specific social niche. These are not soldiers who serve an institution or fighters who belong to a guild like the Companions. They are individuals who have made the judgment that their skills are valuable and that selling those skills on a case-by-case basis is the most viable or most appealing way to organize their working lives. This requires a tolerance for instability that not everyone has, because you're always working contract to contract, always dependent on there being someone with a problem that needs a capable fighter. It also requires a specific kind of self-reliance, because there is no institution looking out for you, no built-in community to return to between jobs. Janassa's Dunmer background adds layers to this. The Dark Elves have a rich and often tragic recent history in the Elder Scrolls universe. Morrowind, the Dunmer homeland, was devastated in the years before Skyrim's events by two sequential catastrophes. First, the eruption of Red Mountain, the massive volcano at the heart of the island of Vardenfell, which caused destruction on a scale that fundamentally disrupted Dunmer civilization. Then the Argonian invasion, which swept into Morrowind from the south while the population was still recovering from the volcanic disaster and caused additional devastation. The result is a Dunmer diaspora scattered across Tamriel, many of them living as refugees in provinces that are not always welcoming. Skyrim itself is not particularly welcoming to Dunmer. Windhelm, as previously discussed, has a designated district for Dunmer called the Grey Quarter. The broader Nord culture, especially in its more nationalist Stormcloak-adjacent expressions, tends to view non-Nord peoples with suspicion or outright hostility. Janassa, navigating this environment as a Dunmer mercenary, surviving and building a professional reputation without the social advantages that a Nord in the same situation would have, implies a degree of skill and self-sufficiency that goes beyond what the game explicitly credits her with. She is also notably flexible in terms of the player's moral choices, a distinction that is relevant to the context of who she is. Many followers in Skyrim have thresholds beyond which they will express discomfort or outright refuse to participate. Janassa does not have the same objections. She will engage in morally complicated scenarios without raising the kind of objections that followers with stronger institutional loyalties or more conventional moral frameworks tend to raise. This is consistent with the mercenary worldview. She is there because she is being paid to do a job. The moral framing of that job is the employer's concern, not hers. As a wife, Janassa keeps her mercenary personality intact. She does not suddenly become soft or domestic or different from who she has been. She sets up a shop and she manages it with practical competence. She continues to speak about the things she finds interesting. And there is something in the texture of marriage to her that feels like genuine partnership between two people who understand how the world actually works, rather than a comfortable fiction about what the world ought to be. She ranks 10 because the combination of her Dunmer cultural background, her mercenary professional identity, her specific aesthetic sensibility, and the coherence of her values across every context make her one of the most distinctly characterized wives in the system. What keeps her from ranking higher is the game's failure to give her backstory the depth it deserves. There is more Janassa than the game shows you, and that invisible remainder holds her back from the higher positions. Rank 9, Muri. Muri is a Breton woman living in Markarth, employed as an apprentice to Bothala at the Hag's Cure, the city's apothecary. She has one of the more genuinely involving personal histories in the marriage pool, and that history is directly connected to one of Skyrim's darker questlines. Understanding who Muri is requires engaging with what happened to her, and what happened to her is not comfortable. She was in a relationship with a man named Alain Dufont. Alain, as she came to understand too late, was using her. He positioned himself in her life, cultivated her trust and affection, and then leveraged that position to commit theft from the household of Muri's employer. The betrayal was not simply personal, it had professional and social consequences. Muri was suspected of involvement. She was expelled from the household where she'd been trusted, the family of Bothala's previous employer. The people who had formed her social support structure blamed her, and she was left to rebuild from a position of genuine isolation. She ended up at the Hag's Cure. She kept working, she kept moving, but she did not forget what Alain had done to her, and she did not make peace with it. Muri's marriage availability is unlocked through the Dark Brotherhood questline. This is itself significant, because the Dark Brotherhood is not a neutral or conventional institution. It is an assassination cult organised around Sithis, the Void, and the Night Mother, its spiritual matron. The player character who reaches Muri through this questline is already operating as the Brotherhood's primary contractor, and Muri is the one who commissioned a contract. She reached out to the Brotherhood, or the player character operating as its representative, to have Alain Dufont killed. She has decided that whatever justice might theoretically be available to her through official channels is either insufficient or inaccessible, and she has chosen a path that bypasses those channels entirely in favour of permanent, definitive consequences. She wants him dead. She is paying to make that happen. One possible reading of this is as the understandable response of a person who is betrayed, stripped of their social standing, and given no adequate recourse. Official Markarth justice is not exactly a reliable institution, given the political dynamics of that city. The Silverblood family's influence over the city guard, the broader corruption in the political landscape, all of it suggests that Muri's assessment that official channels won't work for her is probably accurate. She has gone to the only avenue that she believes can provide the outcome she needs. Another reading is that the hurt of betrayal has pushed her into a moral space she would not have occupied under different circumstances, and that the person she has become in the aftermath of Alain's betrayal is genuinely different from the person she was before it. She was once someone embedded in community, trusted, trusting. She is now someone who commissions assassinations. Both of those versions are real. The betrayal is the hinge between them. There is additional complication in the optional extension of the contract. Muri can ask the player to also kill the woman she believes was complicit in or benefiting from Alain's scheme. Whether that woman was genuinely involved or was an innocent third party who simply had a connection to Alain is not entirely clear from the available information. Muri's willingness to extend the lethal consequences of her grief to someone whose guilt is uncertain is a moral detail that the game doesn't highlight, but also doesn't conceal. She is not simply a wronged woman seeking proportionate justice. She is willing to cast a wide net. As a wife, and this is genuinely interesting, Muri is warm and devoted. She expresses genuine affection. She seems glad to have stability and to have someone she can trust with a trust that is now very carefully given. There is something in the contrast between her post-marriage warmth and her pre-marriage actions that speaks to the complexity of how people actually work. The capacity for genuine connection didn't leave her when she was betrayed. It got redirected, and in some cases redirected into something darker. But the capacity was always there. She ranks 9 because the complexity of her personal history, the moral weight of her questline involvement, the contrast between her darker actions and her genuine warmth, and the psychological layering that results from all of this make her one of the most unusual characters in the marriage pool. She is uncomfortable in interesting ways. The game doesn't fully excavate what it has set up, but the setup itself is rich enough to justify the ranking. Rank 8, Brelina Marion. Brelina Marion is a Dunmer mage attending the College of Winterhold as a student. She is one of the small group of students who form the player character's immediate peer group during the college questline, which means she is one of the few marriage candidates in the game whose relationship with you has the opportunity to develop through genuine, shared experience, rather than being bootstrapped into existence by a prerequisite quest you completed in her general vicinity. The College of Winterhold is Skyrim's institution of magical learning. It sits at the very northeastern edge of the province, perched on what remains of a cliff that was largely destroyed in the event known as the Collapse. The Collapse is a catastrophe that destroyed most of the city of Winterhold decades before the game's events, and the local population blames the college for it, a belief that the college's administration disputes and that the available evidence doesn't definitively settle either way. The result is an institution existing under ongoing social suspicion, surrounded by a city that resents its continued presence, and populated by scholars who have largely made their peace with that resentment while continuing to pursue the work. For a Dunmer student at this institution, the social situation is layered. Dunmer face their own ambient prejudice throughout Skyrim. The college adds an additional layer, its own reputation as a place where people pursue dangerous knowledge in ways that make the local population uncomfortable. Being a Dunmer Mage student at the college means navigating 2 forms of cultural outsider status simultaneously. Brelina comes from House Telvanni. This is a significant piece of background that the game references without fully unpacking it for players who may not have the broader Elder Scrolls context. House Telvanni is one of the great Dunmer noble houses, the one most associated with magical practice, and specifically with a tradition of highly individualistic, self-directed magical research that tends toward the unconventional and the dangerous. Telvanni mages are known for their isolationism, their self-reliance, their willingness to pursue knowledge that other institutions would consider too risky, and their general indifference to what other people think of their methods. They operate from towers, they grow through magical means, and they maintain a culture of earned respect through demonstrated power. Brelina, attending the College of Winterhold, rather than following the more conventional Telvanni path of learning from an established master, is itself an interesting character choice. She is seeking out a different approach. Whether this is because she wants to broaden her magical education beyond what the Telvanni tradition offers, because she had reasons to leave Morrowind that the game doesn't get into, or because she is deliberately choosing a path that distinguishes her from her family background, the game leaves open. But the choice is there, and it implies something about who she is that goes beyond simple happenstance. Her personal questline is brief and played primarily for warmth rather than drama. She's working on a spell, and it goes wrong, with the result that she accidentally transforms the player character into various things over the course of a short sequence. What this quest does, beyond providing some gentle comedy, is reveal something important about how she handles mistakes. She is embarrassed. She is genuinely concerned about having caused problems. She is not cavalier about the failure. She cares about getting it right, and she is willing to be vulnerable about the fact that she didn't. This is an endearing quality that goes against the common portrayal of mages in fantasy games as either arrogant and detached or fanatically focused. Brelina is a student who's trying her best, who sometimes gets things wrong, and who doesn't pretend otherwise. The vulnerability of that is charming in a way that more polished characters often aren't. The shared experience of the college questline, if you complete it with Brelina as part of your social circle there, gives the relationship a foundation that most marriages in the game don't have. You have faced the Eye of Magnus together. You have dealt with Ancano together. You have seen things that most of Skyrim's population will never encounter. The ordinary premise of wandering around Skyrim together in search of adventure is replaced by a specific shared history with genuine stakes. That history is not labelled as a romance arc, but it functions as one in practice. As a wife, she is thoughtful, slightly reserved, and genuinely warm once she trusts you. The House Telvanni reserve doesn't vanish after marriage, but it softens into something that reads as genuine affection rather than performed domesticity. She is still who she was. She has just decided you are worth more of her than she shows most people. She ranks 8 because the college context, the House Telvanni background, the shared questline experience, and the genuine vulnerability of the Spell Gone Wrong quest make her one of the more completely realised characters available for marriage. She has actual depth. She has an actual world she comes from, and the relationship has an actual history behind it. Rank 7. Tari. Tari is an Ultima woman who owns and operates Radiant Raiment, a clothing shop in Solitude. She will, very quickly after meeting her, comment on your appearance. She will tell you that you are not dressed appropriately for someone of apparent status. She will observe, with a specificity that suggests she has given it some actual thought, that your current outfit is doing you no particular favours. This is not behaviour that typically makes a good first impression, and in most social contexts it would be considered rude. And yet Tari is one of the more interesting characters in the marriage pool, precisely because the game takes her aesthetic standards seriously rather than framing them as a quirk to be dismissed or corrected. Solitude is Skyrim's capital city. It is the seat of political power for the Imperial-aligned faction in the Civil War. The Blue Palace sits there. The Jarl's Court operates there. The major commercial and political figures of Imperial Skyrim pass through it. In this environment, how you dress is not a trivial matter. Presentation in Solitude has functional importance that it doesn't have in, for example, Rorikstead or Shawsstone. The people who matter in Solitude are paying attention to whether you look like someone they should take seriously, and dressing like you just crawled out of a dungeon, which you very possibly did, is not going to open doors. Tari knows this. She has built a successful business around it. Her prerequisite quest reflects this. She wants you to wear something she is approved of and accompany her to the Blue Palace to present it to the Jarl's court. This sounds, in isolation, like a strange prerequisite for marriage, but it is character perfectly consistent. Tari is not going to become romantically interested in someone who doesn't understand that walking into the Blue Palace, dressed incorrectly, is a social error with practical consequences. She is testing whether you have the self-awareness and the flexibility to operate in a world where these things matter. If you can do that, you have demonstrated something about yourself that she actually cares about. The Ultima context of her character is complicated by the political realities of Skyrim's era. The Aldmeri Dominion, which the Ultima lead, is in a state of cold war with the Empire following the Great War and the White Gold Concordat. The Thalmor, the Dominion's enforcement arm, are operating throughout Skyrim hunting for Talos worshippers and generally making themselves the most consistently villainous faction in the base game. Ultima in Skyrim carry the weight of their people's political choices, even when, like Tari, they are not personally involved in those politics. Tari is not Thalmor, she is a shopkeeper, but she brings with her the Ultima's characteristic combination of cultural confidence, aesthetic refinement, and the specific variety of arrogance that comes from a society that has genuinely convinced itself of its own superiority. This makes her complicated. Her aesthetic standards are not wrong. Her ability to read a room and understand what matters within it is genuinely valuable intelligence, but she is also willing to make you feel inadequate in ways that are not entirely comfortable, and that willingness doesn't vanish with marriage. As a wife, she is demanding in the sense that she has standards she maintains rather than lowers. She is refined. She is intelligent. She brings a commercial acumen and a social sophistication to home life that creates a very specific kind of domestic environment. It is not warmth in the conventional sense. It is something that could be described as a high-functioning partnership between two people who both understand how the world works and are willing to operate within it on its actual terms. She ranks 7 because the specificity of her personality, the solitude context, the Ultima cultural complexity, and the genuine coherence of her values make her one of the most fully imagined characters in the system. She is not easy. She is not soft. She is real in a way that requires some discomfort to fully appreciate. Rank 6, Ilia. Ilia is a Nord woman you find at the entrance to Darklight Tower, a dungeon in the Rift occupied by a coven of Hagraven worshippers. She's standing outside, and she asks for help before you've had much time to figure out what you're looking at. The help she needs is specific. Her mother is inside. Her mother is about to undergo the Hagraven transformation ritual. She wants to stop it. Hagravens are among the more disturbing creatures in Skyrim's ecology, not because of what they look like, though they are deeply unpleasant, but because of what they represent. They are women who have undergone a ritual that permanently transforms them from human into something else entirely. The ritual is deliberate, it is chosen. It strips away the human form in exchange for significant magical power, and once completed, it is not reversible. The women who choose it are, as a philosophical matter, no longer the people they were. Whatever personhood they had is replaced by something that operates on different drives, different hungers, different values. Ilia's mother has decided to do this. She has decided that the power the transformation offers is worth what it costs. She is willing to stop being human in exchange for something she has decided matters more than her humanity. And Ilia has come to the entrance of the tower, where this is about to happen because she cannot let it proceed. This is the emotional reality behind the dungeon crawl that follows. You are fighting your way through a coven of Hagraven worshippers toward a woman who is about to permanently and irreversibly cease to be her own mother. The combat is straightforward. The thing driving it is not. Ilia's magic use throughout the dungeon is confident and competent. She is not fumbling her way through the fight. She has ability, and she knows how to apply it under pressure. This is a woman who can hold herself together in a genuinely terrible situation and continue to function effectively, which is its own form of strength that the game communicates through action rather than exposition. The resolution of the quest involves confronting her mother directly and ultimately doing what needs to be done to prevent the transformation from completing. The game gives you the option to complete this with Ilya's help, and the emotional weight of that moment, the thing that Ilya has had to do to someone who was once her mother, is real even within the constraints of the game's narrative tools. She doesn't have a monologue about it. She doesn't process it dramatically for the camera. She does what she has done, and then she is on the other side of it, carrying what that cost her. Post-quest Ilya is quieter. She is still capable. She is still worth having as a follower in dangerous situations. But there is a subdued quality to her that wasn't there at the start. The specific kind of quietness that follows from having done something permanent that could not be undone, and that was still the right thing to do. One possible reading of Ilya is as someone who has sacrificed a significant piece of her own history in order to maintain her integrity. Her mother is gone. Whatever connection to family and origin that mother represented is severed. She did this deliberately, knowing what it would cost, because the alternative was to let something terrible happen and be complicit in it through inaction. That is a moral choice with a real price, and the price is written in how she moves and speaks afterward. Her marriage availability comes naturally from the completion of the quest. You have been with her through something genuinely hard. The relationship that gets formalized through an amulet of Mara is already built on something real. As a wife, she is present in a way that feels earned rather than automatic. The depth of what she has been through gives even quiet domestic moments a different texture, because you know what she has had to do and what that has cost her, and she knows that you know. There is an unspoken foundation there that many of the other marriages don't have. She ranks 6 because the Dark Light Tower introduction is one of the most emotionally significant character introductions in the entire marriage pool, and the moral weight of Ilya's situation, what she has done and continues to carry, makes her one of the more genuinely affecting characters on this list. The game's post-marriage characterization doesn't fully honor what it has set up, but the setup is strong enough to earn this position. Rank 5. Iona. Iona is the housecarl assigned to you when you become Thane of the Rift, appointed by Jarl Layla Lawgiver in Riften. She is available as a companion and as a potential wife, and she is one of those characters whose appeal requires understanding both what she is and what the role she fills actually means in the context of Skyrim's world. Housecarls are a specific institution in Nord culture. They are sworn bodyguards and household managers assigned by a Jarl to their Thanes, which means they are people who have been vetted at the governmental level and who are being trusted to protect someone of political significance. The oath they take is not casual, it is binding in a way that the culture takes seriously. When Iona swears to carry your burdens and defend you with her life, she means it in a formal sense that carries institutional and cultural weight beyond the personal commitment. This creates an interesting starting dynamic for any romantic relationship that develops. Iona's relationship with you begins as one of obligation and sworn service. She is there because she has been assigned to be there. The question of whether and how that relationship develops into something more personal, more chosen, rather than simply maintained through duty, is the interesting part that the game leaves largely to implication. What Iona's dialogue suggests is that she has not entirely subordinated her personality to her professional role. She is direct, she has opinions she will share, and she carries herself with a confidence that implies a person who has not simply disappeared into the job. The best housecarls in terms of character differentiation are the ones who remain themselves while also being fully committed to the role, and Iona is one of those. Her Riften context is worth taking seriously. Riften is, as has been established at multiple points in this video, a city with deep structural corruption. The Thieves' Guild controls significant elements of the city's economic life. The Blackbriar family functions as an untouchable political authority. The city guard is compromised. For a housecarl to operate in this environment, to fulfill the role of protecting the Thane and managing their household in a city where the official power structures are honeycombed with corruption, requires navigating that environment every day without the luxury of pretending it isn't there. Iona's loyalty in Riften carries a different texture from, say, Lydia's loyalty in Whiterun. Whiterun is not a perfect city, but its political situation is relatively functional compared to Riften's. Being loyal in Riften means being loyal in a place where loyalty is one of the most contested values available, where everyone seems to be buying and selling commitment based on what it's worth in any given moment. Against that background, Iona's straightforward, unhesitating dedication is almost a political statement. The Rift as a hold also has its own social and geographic character. It is a hold of forests and lakes, with the autumn colours that make it one of the most visually distinctive regions in the game. Riften sits at the edge of Lake Honrich. The Rift's towns and settlements have a different flavour from the windswept tundra of the Pale or the volcanic ash of Eastmarch. There is something lush and complicated about the Rift that its housecarl carries in her background, even if the game doesn't explicitly address it. As a wife, Iona is steady. The transition from housecarl to spouse doesn't require her to become someone different, because who she has always been is someone defined by commitment and capable service. The marriage just reframes the nature of that commitment from institutional obligation to personal choice. The quality of the commitment is the same. The origin of it is different, and that difference is worth something. She ranks 5 because, among the housecarl wives, she offers one of the more distinct personalities, and the Riften context gives her an interesting environment to have been shaped by. Her limitations are the generic housecarl limitations. No personal quest, backstory largely implied rather than stated, but within those constraints, she is well used. Rank 4. Jordis the Sword Maiden. Jordis the Sword Maiden is the housecarl appointed to you when you become Thane of Harfingar, the hold whose principal city is Solitude. She is, by the logic of the appointment system, the housecarl of the most politically significant ordinary hold in Skyrim, given that Solitude is the seat of the High King's authority and the centre of imperial governance in the province. The role she fills is, in institutional terms, the most significant of any housecarl in the game. Her title is worth careful attention. A sword maiden, or shield maiden in the related traditional term, is a woman who has chosen the warrior's path, who has taken up weapons and trained for combat rather than following the conventionally domestic tracks that Nord society has typically expected of women. This title was not given to Jordis by administrative default when she became a housecarl. It points toward a deliberate choice she made about her identity, a path she pursued rather than inherited, a designation that represents something she worked toward because it reflected who she chose to be. The Shield Maiden tradition in Nord culture has deep roots in the mythology of the people, going back to legendary figures who fought alongside the heroes of the ancient age. In the era of the game, this tradition has not entirely disappeared, but it coexists with social pressures that don't always make it easy for women to occupy warrior roles without negotiating against expectation. Jordis has apparently made that negotiation and emerged with her chosen identity intact, and the title reflects it. Her bearing reflects the Solitude environment in a way that is apparent even in brief conversations with her. She is composed, she is socially capable. She knows how to move through a world where presentation and behaviour carry weight, and she does so without effort. Solitude is a city that requires this kind of sophistication. The court politics, the merchant networks, the military command structures that pass through the city all create an environment where the ability to read rooms and behave appropriately in them is a genuinely useful skill. A housecarl appointed by Solitude's Jarl and operating in that context has developed this skill out of practical necessity. Her combat capability is solid rather than spectacular. She is versatile with weapons, she handles herself well in challenging situations, and she has the endurance that a bodyguard role requires, the ability to remain effective through extended engagements rather than burning brightly for a short period and collapsing. This is the martial profile of a professional rather than a performer. She is not trying to be impressive, she is trying to do the job well. What the Sword Maiden title implies about her personal history is the most interesting element of her character. She made a choice about her identity. She trained to be what she is. And she arrived at Solitude's Thane position with a title that reflects who she is rather than simply what she was assigned. The gap between that history and what the game actually tells you about it is significant, but the title itself does a lot of work. As a wife, she carries the Solitude context with her. She is composed, she is intelligent, she is capable in the practical domains that matter to her. She brings a specific kind of dignity into the home that is connected to where she comes from and who she has chosen to be. There is no turbulence in a marriage to Jordis. There is competence, commitment, and the specific kind of warmth that a composed person extends when they have decided you're worth extending it toward. She ranks 4 because the Sword Maiden title, the Solitude political context, her personal composure, and the implied history behind the choice to be who she is, make her one of the more distinctly conceived housecarl wives. She has more implied depth than most, and the setting she comes from does genuine character work on her behalf. Rank 3. Lydia. Lydia, the woman who has spent over a decade in the cultural memory of Skyrim's player base as the most famous companion in an open-world game full of companions. She has been the subject of memes and forum arguments and fan art, and the universal experience of watching her walk into the doorway you need to get through and stand there as if she owns it. She is, in the cultural sense, inescapable. But let's talk about her actual lore, because the cultural weight of her existence has a way of making people think they know more about her than the game actually tells them. Lydia is appointed your housecarl by Jarl Balgruuf the Greater of Whiterun after you retrieve the Dragonstone from Bleakfall's Barrow and are subsequently made Thane of Whiterun. This appointment comes in the immediate aftermath of killing your first dragon and absorbing its soul, and it happens quickly enough that many players don't fully register the significance of what's being given to them. Balgruuf has just observed, or received reports of, someone who did something that should not be possible for an ordinary person. Absorbing a dragon soul is not something that happens, and his response is to assign someone sworn to protect this person with her life. Lydia's oath of loyalty is unconditional in a way that stands out even among housecarls. She will carry your burdens. She will fight your enemies. She will stand between you and whatever is trying to kill you, regardless of what that thing is or how outmatched you might be. Her famous line, the one about being sworn to carry your burdens, is delivered without irony and without resentment. She is a housecarl. This is the role. She has apparently decided to fill it completely. The gap between how fully realised Lydia feels to most players and how little the game actually tells you about her is one of the more interesting facts about how character attachment works in games. She has no personal quest. She has no family that the game reveals to you. She has no backstory that gets disclosed through conversation or dialogue option. She shows up, she swears her oath, and she starts walking behind you into whatever you've decided to walk into. And yet most players develop a genuine emotional relationship with her. Part of this is the sheer amount of time involved. Lydia is present for more of a typical playthrough than almost any other NPC, because players often keep her as their follower for much of the early and middle game. She witnesses things. She is standing behind you when you make decisions. She reacts, in her minimal way, to what happens around her. She is there for enough of your story that she starts to feel like she has a story of her own, even if the game hasn't written one for her. Part of it is the dry quality of her delivery. When Lydia makes an observation about the world around her, it tends to be direct and without drama. She doesn't emote at everything. She doesn't pretend to be more impressed than she is. She says the thing and moves on. In the middle of circumstances that are genuinely extraordinary, dragons and ancient prophecies and the end of the world, she tends to function as a grounding presence rather than an amplifying one. And that consistency has a way of feeling like personality, even when it's equally possible. It's just her default behavioural mode. One possible reading of Lydia is as a portrait of devoted service, as a form of identity. She is not a person who chafes against her role or performs it reluctantly while secretly wanting something else. Everything the game shows you about her suggests someone who has found her purpose in the function she fulfills. The housecarl role is not a constraint on who she is, it is who she is. And whatever the philosophical implications of a life organised entirely around service to someone else, the game presents it as genuine rather than tragic. Another reading, and this one is harder to dismiss, is that the game simply didn't give her enough development to know what is underneath the role. She might have a rich inner life that the game has no mechanism to express. She might carry weight from her life before the appointment that we never get to see. She might have ambitions or sorrows or connections to the world that exist in the space the game didn't give her room to fill. We genuinely don't know, and the game doesn't resolve the question. As a wife, Lydia is exactly what she was as a housecarl. Steady, loyal, present. She doesn't change dramatically after marriage. She is still Lydia. The domestic life she inhabits has the same quality as everything else about her. Functional, consistent, reliable. The warmth is there, but it is expressed in the same understated register as everything else she does. It doesn't announce itself. She ranks third not because she is the most deeply written character on this list, because she almost certainly isn't. She ranks third because the combination of her accessibility, her long cultural history with the player base, her dry and grounding presence, and the emotional work that players do on her behalf without the game requiring it, makes the relationship between player and Lydia one of the more developed in the game. Even though much of that development is happening in the player's imagination rather than the game's writing. She is part the game's work and part the player's projection, and the collaboration between those two things has produced something that feels more complete than either part would on its own. Rank 2. Mjol the Lioness. Mjol the Lioness is a Nord warrior who has made her home in Riften, and she is one of the most fully realised characters in the marriage system on the basis of what the game's actual writing gives her. She has a backstory that the player can discover through conversation. She has convictions that she articulates clearly and consistently. She has an ongoing personal mission that she continues to pursue regardless of what the player is doing. She has a companion in Erin whose presence in her life raises interesting questions, and she has opinions about Riften's corruption that she will expand upon at considerable length if you give her the opportunity. She is, in brief, someone who has done things and thought about them afterward. Her backstory involves a serious adventure gone wrong. She was exploring Dwemer ruins, specifically Mzincha left in the Pale, and something happened. She was injured badly enough that she nearly died. She also lost her sword, Grimsever, in the ruins. When she describes these events, there is something in how she talks about the sword in particular that reveals something important. The loss of Grimsever was not simply the loss of a tool. It was the loss of something she had travelled with, fought with, and built a significant part of her identity around. Getting hurt is survivable. Leaving the sword behind was something she has not entirely made peace with. When you retrieve Grimsever for her, the game gives you one of the more genuinely affecting moments in the marriage-adjacent questlines. Her response to getting it back is not simply gratitude in the generic NPC sense. It is the specific response of someone who has recovered something they thought was permanently lost. There is an emotional texture to it that the game handles with more subtlety than most of its quests manage, and it leaves the impression that Mjol is someone for whom objects and places and experiences carry genuine meaning rather than being interchangeable. Her mission in Riften is equally clear and equally consistent. She is opposed to the Thieves' Guild and the broader corruption that has made Riften the kind of city it is. She doesn't express this as an abstract philosophical position. She expresses it as something she actively works toward. She patrols. She keeps her eyes open. She makes her position clear to everyone who spends more than a few minutes in conversation with her. She believes Riften can be better than it currently is, and she has decided, against all practical evidence to the contrary, that staying in it and pushing toward that better version is the right thing to do. This is worth emphasizing because it distinguishes her from almost every other wife in the marriage pool. She is not waiting for the player character to arrive and provide her life with purpose. She already has purpose. She is already doing something. The Dragonborn showing up in Riften and potentially marrying her is not the thing that gives Mjol's story meaning. She would keep doing what she does regardless. The marriage becomes part of a life that was already in motion, not the event that sets that life moving. Erin deserves specific attention because he is a genuinely unusual element of marriage to Mjol. He is the man who found her near death after Masincha left and nursed her back to health. He is devoted to her in a way that the game presents, without quite specifying its nature. Whether their relationship is romantic, whether it is a deep platonic bond, whether Erin has feelings for Mjol that she does not reciprocate, is left somewhat open. What is not open is that when you marry Mjol, Erin comes with her. He moves into your home. He is simply there, a part of the domestic arrangement that no one explicitly asked for, but that Mjol apparently considers non-negotiable. This is, depending on how you read it, either a clumsy game design decision or one of the more interesting character details in the marriage pool. If you take it seriously as a choice rather than an oversight, it says something meaningful about Mjol. She does not abandon the people who were there for her when she needed them. Erin saved her life. She does not leave him behind simply because her circumstances have changed. She carries her obligations to the people she cares about, even when those obligations make her less tidy as a romantic option. That is a specific kind of loyalty that reveals something about her values in a way that her explicit dialogue about the Thieves' Guild doesn't quite manage. As a wife, Mjol remains herself. She doesn't lose her convictions or her mission when she moves into your home. She continues to care about Riften. She continues to express opinions about the guild and the corruption. She is not performing domesticity while her real self waits elsewhere. She is fully present in her marriage in the same way she was fully present in everything else, with her whole character intact rather than the domesticated version of it. She ranks second because the combination of actual backstory, clear and consistently expressed personal convictions, an ongoing independent mission, the interesting question of Erin's presence, and the genuinely affecting sword recovery quest make her one of the most completely written characters in the marriage system. The game could have given her more and would have been improved by doing so, but what is actually there is some of the best marriage content in the base game. Rank 1. Isla the Huntress. Isla the Huntress is a Nord warrior, a senior member of the Companions' Inner Circle, a werewolf by choice and continued preference, and by almost any measure, the most narratively rich wife available in Skyrim's base game. She has been at or near the top of most players' Skyrim wife rankings since the game was released in 2011, and while popularity and quality are not always the same thing, in this case the popular assessment has a significant body of lore to back it up. Her relationship with the companions is not that of someone who joined an organization. It is the relationship of someone who grew up within one. She did not come to Jorvaska as a recruit looking for a place to belong. The companions, their history, their values, their culture, their daily rhythms, are all things that Ayla has known her entire life. Kodlak Whitemane, the Harbinger, is a figure of authority and affection to her in the way that a family elder is. Not a boss she respects professionally, but someone she has been in genuine relationship with for years. The institution is not something she chose as an adult making a deliberate decision about her path. It is the environment she was raised in, and it has shaped her more completely than any institution shapes most of the other characters in the game. This gives her relationship with the companions' most complex element, the lycanthropy, a different character than it has for any other member of the circle. The beast blood, the werewolf condition that the inner circle members share, was not something she encountered and had to decide how to relate to as an adult coming to it from the outside. She came to it from within the institution, within the culture, within a community that had its own relationship with what it meant and what it cost and what it offered, and she decided, based on all of that context, that it was part of who she is. Kodlak Whitemane's arc in the companion's questline is specifically about wanting to die as a man rather than a beast. He believes that the beast blood will send his soul to Hersine's hunting grounds after death rather than to Sovngarde, the Nordic afterlife of honoured warriors. This troubles him deeply. He wants to be cleansed before he dies, and the companion's questline in part involves trying to fulfill that wish. He does not view the lycanthropy as a gift without cost. He views it as something that needs to be resolved. Ayla doesn't share this view, and she's not quiet about not sharing it. She has looked at the same question Kodlak has found troubling and arrived at a different answer. The beast blood is part of her. She does not experience it as a wound or a debt or something sitting over her. She has integrated it into her sense of self in a way that is complete rather than provisional. When the other circle members are eventually offered the chance to be cleansed of the beast blood through a ritual involving the companion's questline's resolution, Ayla opts out. She keeps hers. Voluntarily, with full understanding of what that choice means for the fate of her soul, according to the framework she has grown up within. This is a meaningful character statement expressed through a game mechanic, which is one of the more elegant ways Skyrim occasionally uses its systems to say something about a person. Ayla knows the same things Kodlak knows about the lycanthropy and what it implies. She has simply made a different judgment about what those implications mean for how she should live. That difference in judgment is not presented as error or failure. It is presented as Ayla, which is the most complete way the game can honour the integrity of her position. Her training role as an archery master is worth dwelling on. Archery at master level requires more than physical skill. It requires the integration of patience, breath control, environmental reading, tracking, and the sustained attention that hunting demands. It is not a combat skill that translates simply from one context to another. You have to actually understand how to move through wilderness and read an animal's behaviour and find the position that gives you the shot, and then stay still enough and calm enough to take that shot under pressure. Teaching this at master level implies that Ayla has that understanding at a deep level that goes beyond technique into the way she moves through the world entirely. The companion's questline, when it reaches its central tragedy, involves the death of Skjor. Skjor is a senior circle member who is clearly important to Ayla in ways that the game handles with deliberate, understated quality. He is her partner in the hunt. He is someone she has been in close relationship with for years within the institution that forms the centre of her life. The game implies a depth to their connection without specifying its exact nature, which gives Ayla's grief after his death more room to breathe than it would have if the relationship had been spelled out explicitly. When Skjor dies at the hands of the Silver Hand, Ayla's response is grief made into action. She channels what she's feeling into a campaign of vengeance against the silver hand that she asks the player to participate in, and the emotional force behind that campaign is real. This is one of the few moments in the game where you're asked to join a character in violence that is explicitly driven by loss, not by quest objectives or strategic military logic or anything abstract, but by a person's grief and what that grief has decided to do with itself. The moral texture of that is complicated. The Silver Hand are not innocent people, but the campaign Ayla is running is not cleanly about justice either. It is about loss and what loss does to a person who expresses themselves primarily through action. Her post-questline character carries that grief without making a spectacle of it. She continues to hunt. She continues to train the player in archery if asked. She continues to be fully herself. The loss doesn't define her the way it might define a less complete character. The kind of character whose entire personality is organized around a wound. Ayla's grief is real and it is present, but it is one element of a full person rather than the explanation for everything she is. As a wife, she is consistent with everything the player has experienced of her throughout the questline. She doesn't become soft or domesticated in ways that would feel incongruous. She is still Ayla. She still cares about the hunt and the companions and the things she has always cared about. The marriage adds a layer of tenderness to someone who was already complete, which is a different thing from the marriage completing someone who was incomplete without it. This is the quality that puts Ayla at the top of this ranking. Most wives in the game orbit around the player character, in the sense that the player character is the primary source of meaning in their story. You are the thing that gives them context and significance. Ayla doesn't work this way. She has her own history, her own institution, her own relationships, her own convictions, her own complicated and fully inhabited relationship with the beast blood she carries. She was a complete person before you arrived in Whiterun. You can become part of her world, but you are not the reason her world exists. That distinction between a character who exists in relation to the player and a character who exists independently and allows the player to enter is one of the hardest things to write well in any narrative. And it is the thing that makes Ayla feel different from almost everyone else on this list. She is a hunter. She runs at night in a form that is not human, and she finds something in that she would not trade. She grieves the people she has lost, and she doesn't make a performance of that grief. She belongs to an institution that has shaped her in ways she would not choose to undo. She has made choices that other people in her position found troubling, and she has stood by those choices without apology or hesitation. She is fully herself in the way that only the best written characters ever quite manage to be. And that is every marriageable wife in Skyrim's base game, from the overlooked to the iconic, from Grelka holding her prices firm in a city that doesn't deserve her stubbornness, all the way up to Ayla choosing the beast blood over Sovngarde because she knows exactly who she is, and she has decided that is not something worth trading away. 24 women, 24 sets of circumstances, histories, cultures, wounds, and choices that the game mostly gave you just enough of to want the rest. Continue from where you left off no matter what. 9:43 p.m. deliberated, extending script with overlooked characters and thematic content. Deliberated, extending script with overlooked characters and thematic content. There is one thing worth saying before this video moves into its next phase, which is that the ranking you just heard covered the 24 most commonly discussed wives in the base game and the Dragonborn DLC, but it did not cover all of them. There are a handful of marriageable women that most Skyrim wife content either skips entirely or lumps into a brief mention at the end, and this video is not going to do that. The point of this project was always to take each of these characters seriously on their own terms, and that commitment applies to the ones at the back of the list as much as it applies to Ayla. So we are going to keep going. There are also several wives who come with DLC content beyond Dragonborn, namely the Dawnguard expansion and the hearthfire building content, and they deserve their own treatment rather than an afterthought. After that, this video is going to do something a little different and spend some time on the larger question of what marriage in Skyrim's world actually means in cultural and historical terms, because the system the player uses is a simplified game mechanic sitting on top of a much more complicated social reality that the lore points toward without fully explaining. That is worth exploring. And then we are going to end with an extended look at 3 characters whose stories branch into territory the ranking format couldn't fully accommodate. So, let's continue. Temba Wide Arm. Temba Wide Arm is a Nord woman who runs Ivarstead's lumber mill. If that description sounds familiar, it is because the bottom of this ranking list involved a significant cluster of Nord women running lumber mills, and Temba belongs to that cluster. But she has a specific and persistent grievance that distinguishes her from Gilfrey and Erie in ways that are worth examining. Ivarstead is the small village at the base of the throat of the world. It is the last populated place before the long climb up the 7,000 steps to High Hrothgar, and its entire identity is shaped by its position at that base. Pilgrims pass through, travellers rest there on their way up or down. The village's economy and social atmosphere are both defined by its proximity to something sacred and enormous that most of its residents have never personally climbed. This creates an interesting social texture. The people of Ivarstead live their daily lives adjacent to Skyrim's most spiritually significant landmark without necessarily participating in what that landmark means. They watch pilgrims go up the mountain, they watch pilgrims come down, they operate the inn and the mill and the small daily economy of the place, and they do this in a location that is also not particularly comfortable, situated at the bottom of an enormous mountain in a region that gets significant weather. Temba's specific grievance is bears, not metaphorically, literally bears. She has a persistent problem with bears damaging her operations, and she will offer to pay for bear pelts as a way of addressing this problem. The quest associated with her is purely practical. Collect bear pelts, deliver them to her, get paid. But the bear problem itself is an interesting detail. Bears have apparently made a consistent enough nuisance of themselves around her mill that she has incorporated dealing with them into her ongoing business planning. This is not a one-time event. This is the situation she operates in. There is something very grounded about a character whose defining quest is managing wildlife interference with a business. It's not heroic. It's not tied to any of Skyrim's larger conflicts. It's the ongoing practical reality of running a lumber operation near the mountain where the bears live. And Temba's response to it is neither panic nor resignation, but practical problem solving. She has a resource problem. She is offering compensation to whoever can help solve it. She will deal with the rest. Her name is also worth noting briefly. Wide Arm is not an obvious Nord surname, and it suggests either a physical characteristic or possibly a reputation for generosity or breadth of welcome, depending on how you interpret it. The game doesn't explain it. She has the name, and she has the bears, and she has the mill at the base of the most sacred mountain in Skyrim, and she appears to have made a fully functional life within those constraints without requiring anything particularly dramatic from the situation. As a wife, she's in the same general register as Gilfra and Aerie. She's competent. She is practical. She manages the shop function without drama. She doesn't develop in surprising directions after marriage. She is a lumber mill operator who is good at what she does and who brings that practical competence to domestic life in the same way she brings it to everything else. What places Temba slightly above the bottom tier of that lumber mill cluster is the specificity of the bear problem, which sounds absurd as a distinguishing character detail, but actually does something important. It makes her feel like someone operating in a specific place with specific ongoing challenges rather than a generic lumber mill owner. She has a particular problem and a particular response to it. The particularity matters. Serene Gerard. Serene Gerard is a Breton woman associated with the Dawnguard questline. She appears at Fort Dawnguard after being recruited into the organization, and her professional identity is built entirely around a very specific area of expertise. She is an engineer and technician with a deep and long-standing obsession with Dwemer crossbow technology. This is an unusual specialization, even by the standards of a world where unusual specializations are fairly common. The Dwemer, as a civilization, left behind technology that the current inhabitants of Tamriel have largely been unable to replicate or fully understand. Their constructs still function centuries after the civilization that built them vanished. Their weapons have mechanical sophistication that exceeds what modern smithing traditions can match. For a living person to have developed genuine expertise in understanding and working with Dwemer crossbow mechanisms is a meaningful distinction. It means she has spent a significant portion of her life studying things that most scholars treat as impenetrable. Her introduction in the Dawnguard questline involves finding her in the wilderness, where she has been searching for Dwemer artifacts that she believes contain the components she needs for her research. She is deeply focused on this search to the point that her surroundings have become secondary. The world is full of vampires and ancient threats, and a faction war between the Dawnguard and Harkon's court, and Serene is out in a field somewhere looking for a specific Dwemer gyro because she needs it for her crossbow work. Her priorities are extremely clear, and they are not calibrated to what the current crisis might suggest they should be. This quality of focused, slightly eccentric expertise is one of the more lovable character traits in the Dawnguard companion and ally pool. She is genuinely brilliant in a narrow domain. She has dedicated herself to understanding something that most people have given up on as too opaque or too dangerous, and she has made genuine progress. The enhanced crossbow variants she eventually develops for the Dawnguard faction are a material expression of that expertise, and they are functional and powerful in ways that matter within the game's mechanics. Her Breton background reinforces the characterization. Bretons, as established in the Senna section, are associated with learning and intellectual engagement with the world. Serene exemplifies a specific variety of that, the technical and mechanical rather than the arcane. She is not a mage, she is an engineer. She applies the same kind of careful analytical attention to physical mechanisms that other Bretons apply to magical theory, and the result is someone who understands how things work at a level that gives her genuine practical power. The Dawnguard context adds background weight. The conflict between the Dawnguard and Harkon's vampire court is about what Tamriel will look like after the tyranny of the sun prophecy is either fulfilled or prevented. Serene is in the middle of this because she joined an organization that turned out to be at the center of a conflict with world-altering implications. She showed up to do crossbow research and ended up participating in something considerably larger than her initial expectations. This is a relatable position that the game doesn't make much of explicitly, but that gives her a certain humanizing quality. She is not a person who sought apocalyptic stakes. She followed her interest in Dwemer mechanisms, and the rest developed around her. As a wife, Serene maintains her specific enthusiasms. She continues to have opinions about crossbow design. She is warm without being demonstrative. The intellectual companionship she offers is genuine. She is someone who thinks carefully about specific things and who will share that thinking with you. And for a player character who spends most of their life in dungeons and wilderness, having someone at home who is genuinely interested in how things work is its own form of refreshing. She is one of the more interesting DLC wives on the basis of her professional identity alone, and the Dawnguard questline gives the relationship a shared experiential foundation that purely base game marriages sometimes lack. Heland. Heland is a Skarl-adjacent woman on Solstheim, associated with the Thirsk Mead Hall rather than with Skarl Village itself. This distinction matters because the Thirsk Mead Hall has its own specific cultural situation that differs from the Skarl tradition, and Hieland occupies that situation in a way that is interesting even if the game's development of her character is thin. Thirsk Mead Hall has a history of being occupied and reoccupied. It was originally a Nord hall built by settlers who came to Solstheim and tried to maintain their mainland cultural practices in the island environment. The hall has a tradition of strong leadership and communal Nord warrior culture, but by the time the Dragonborn DLC takes place, it has been taken over by a group of Rieklings, the small goblin-like creatures native to Solstheim. The original occupants have been displaced to a camp outside, and the central activity of one of the Dragonborn questlines involves resolving this situation in one direction or another. Hieland is one of the displaced Nord residents. Her life has been disrupted by the Riekling occupation, and the quest structure around Thirsk involves her community trying to reclaim what they've lost. Whether the game's resolution of that situation reflects well on either side depends heavily on which direction you push the quest, and the moral ambiguity there is characteristic of Dragonborn's approach to the island's various conflicts. What makes Hieland interesting as a marriage candidate in the limited terms the game provides is the Thirsk context itself. She is not a Skarl. She doesn't follow the Allmaker tradition. She is a Nord woman on an island that is not quite like anywhere else, trying to maintain a connection to cultural practices that are slightly out of place in the environment she's in. There is a displacement quality to her situation that gives her a different texture from the firmly rooted Morwen at Skarl Village. Her prerequisite quest involves collecting a specific number of Riekling spears. This is a more demanding prerequisite than most of the other wives, purely in terms of the number of items required, and completing it gives a sense of her practical values. She is not asking you to perform something symbolically significant. She is asking you to demonstrate the kind of sustained effort and resource gathering that her community needs in order to operate effectively. The spears have practical use. The task is grounded in the material reality of life at Thirsk. As a wife, Hieland is similarly grounded. She doesn't have the spiritual depth that the Skarl context gives Morwen, and she doesn't have a personal story with the emotional weight of some of the wives higher on the original ranking list. She is competent, she is warm, and she is living in one of the more unusual corners of the game's geography, which gives her a flavour that purely mainland wives don't have. Raya. Raya is the housecarl assigned to you when you become Thane of Falkreath, and she is one of the Hearthfire DLC additions to the marriage pool. Hearthfire is primarily a building and homestead expansion, allowing the player to construct homes in 3 different holds, including Falkreath, and the housecarls who come with those holds are part of that expansion's design. She is a Redguard woman, which makes her one of the very few Redguard marriage candidates in the game, and the immediate context of Falkreath Hold gives her a specific geographic and atmospheric background. Falkreath is a hold defined by its enormous cemetery, which serves the entirety of Skyrim rather than just the local population, and by the dense pine forests that cover much of its terrain. It is a place associated with death, remembrance, and the quiet that comes from living among the dead in a landscape that feels somewhat removed from the political urgency of the Civil War and the Dragon Crisis. The Hold's major city is small and quiet. The atmosphere is contemplative. Raya's Redguard background is one of the more underexplored cultural elements in the game's marriage content. The Redguard of Hammerfell are known throughout Tamriel for a warrior tradition that emphasizes technique, discipline, and individual martial excellence above the raw aggression that characterizes some other combat cultures. The Alaka warriors who appear in Skyrim, along with the broader cultural references scattered through the game's dialogue and books, establish the Redguard as a people with a specific and sophisticated approach to fighting that has a depth to it that gets underrepresented in how other cultures talk about them. Being a Redguard housecarl in Falkreath, operating in a predominantly Nord hold, with its own specific cultural practices and political situation, means navigating the same outsider status that many non-Nord characters throughout the game deal with in various ways. Raya has done this successfully enough to achieve a position of genuine institutional trust, which is its own quiet form of distinction. Her combat orientation is toward weapons rather than magic, consistent with the Redguard martial tradition, and she handles herself well as a follower in the kind of physical combat encounters that Falkreath's wilderness presents. Bears, wolves, bandits, and the general danger of Skyrim's outdoors are not things she's unfamiliar with. As a wife, Raya is warm and steady. The Falkreath context, the quiet hold with its cemetery and its forests, shapes her in ways the game doesn't fully articulate, but that come through in the general quality of presence she has. She is not turbulent, she is not dramatic, she is someone who has found a place to stand, chosen to stand well in it, and who extends that stability to the people she chooses to let into her life. She ranks slightly above the minimum housecarl tier on the basis of the Redguard cultural context, which does more work than the game explicitly acknowledges, and the Falkreath setting, which has a distinctive, atmospheric quality that gives her background a flavour that is genuinely different from the other housecarl wives. Now, let's step back from the individual characters for a while and talk about something that sits underneath all of them, which is the question of what marriage in Skyrim's world actually was and is outside of the game's mechanics. The Amulet of Mara is the marriage mechanism in the game. You wear it, certain characters respond to it with romantic availability, and from there, a brief ceremony at the Temple of Mara in Riften formalizes the union. The ease and speed of this process is part of the game's design, intended to make the system accessible rather than burdensome. But the underlying institution, the cult of Mara and its role in formalizing relationships across Tamriel, has considerably more depth in the lore than the game's mechanical streamlining suggests. Mara is one of the 9 divines, the major deities worshipped across Tamriel's human-dominated cultures. Her specific domain is love, compassion, and family, and the faith organized around her has a long history that predates the particular forms it takes in Skyrim's era. The temple at Riften, where player marriages take place, is a functioning religious institution with its own community of priests and worshippers, and the marriage ceremony it performs is a genuine religious rite rather than simply an administrative formality. The Amulet of Mara itself in-world signals that the wearer is open to a romantic connection, a kind of public declaration of availability that other members of the faith would recognize. The specific mechanism of wearing it and having characters respond to it in the game is a simplified version of what the lore suggests would be a more gradual and socially embedded process of courtship and religious community involvement. But the signal it sends is genuine within the world's own terms. Mara's blessing is being sought. The person wearing it is asking for what Mara's domain encompasses, which is not just romantic connection in the narrow sense, but the broader territory of love, commitment, and the building of a household. The Temple of Mara in Riften is run by Maramil, a priest whose interactions with the player are brief, but who represents a genuine institutional reality. He can sell you the Amulet of Mara. He can explain what it signifies. He officiates at marriages, and the temple he works in is an ongoing community that provides services to Riften's population beyond the specific needs of the Dragonborn. It is a place where people come to seek Mara's blessing for relationships, for families, for the general project of love in a world that makes that project difficult. The choice of Riften as the location for Tamriel's best-known Temple of Mara is worth thinking about. Riften, as this video has established in some detail, is one of Skyrim's most corruption-ridden cities. The Thieves' Guild operates there. The Blackbriar family controls it. Official justice is compromised. The social fabric is frayed in ways that the people living in it feel every day. And in the middle of all of this is a temple dedicated to love and compassion and the protection of family bonds. The contrast is not accidental. Mara's temple sitting in Riften is the game saying, among other things, that love persists even in places where everything around it is working against it. The broader history of marriage practices across Tamriel's cultures is varied enough to take some time with. Nord marriage tradition, specifically, is worth examining because it is the dominant cultural context in Skyrim, the one that most of the game's marriage candidates come from, and that shapes the general social environment within which the game's marriages take place. Nord marriage traditions have historically emphasized practical, alliance and household building over romantic sentiment, though romantic sentiment has always been present in the culture, even when it wasn't the primary public justification for a union. The old Nord traditions connected marriage to family honor, economic stability, and the production of the next generation of warriors and household managers. A marriage was an agreement between families as much as between individuals, and the expectations placed on both parties were framed in terms of what they would contribute to the combined household and bloodline, rather than purely in terms of personal happiness. This framework was never absolute, and by the era of Skyrim's events, it has been significantly modified by the influence of the imperial culture that has been present in the province for centuries. The Imperials brought their own marriage traditions, influenced by both the Nine Divines religious framework and the administrative and legal practices of the Empire, which gave marriage a more individual and contractual character than the older Nord clan-based model. The two traditions exist in the game's era in a kind of ongoing negotiation with each other, which is part of why a ceremony at the Temple of Mara works as the marriage mechanism, regardless of whether the characters involved are Nords with a traditionalist orientation or Imperials with a different set of cultural expectations. The Orsimer marriage system, already discussed in the context of Borgak's section, represents perhaps the most explicitly codified alternative to the general Tamrielic norm. The chief's right to claim wives within the stronghold structure, the expectations placed on non-chief men regarding either service or departure, and the cultural framework of Malakath's code that underlies all of it, constitute a complete alternative social system rather than simply a variation on the standard model. When Borgak marries the Dragonborn through Mara's mechanism, she is in some sense exiting one marriage system and entering another, a transition that the game doesn't fully address but that carries genuine cultural weight. The Argonian approach to relationship and family is among the most lore-rich of all Tamriel's cultures when you dig into the wider Elder Scrolls source material, because it is inextricably connected to the Hist. In Black Marsh, relationships among Argonians exist within a web of connection to the histories that has no equivalent in other cultures. The Hist influence on Argonian development and identity is profound enough that the question of what a relationship between two Argonians means independently of that influence is genuinely complicated. In Skyrim, separated from the Hist to whatever degree, Argonian characters, like Shavi, are navigating a version of community and connection that is already filtered through displacement, and the marriage system they can be accessed through is an imperial-influenced religious institution that has nothing structurally to do with how Argonian relationships are organized in their homeland. The Dunmer relationship tradition is shaped by both the culture of Morrowind and the specific recent history of displacement and diaspora that has sent large numbers of Dunmer into Skyrim and other provinces. Morrowind's Great House system, of which Brelina's House Telvanni was one example, historically organised Dunmer social life, including marriage into webs of political and economic alliance between houses. In the diaspora, with those house structures disrupted or inaccessible, the marriage practices of Dunmer, like Brelina and Janassa, are improvised in ways that the characters themselves probably feel, in some dimension, even if they don't articulate it. The old framework for what a relationship means and how it gets formalized has been disrupted by the same catastrophe that displaced them. Breton culture, with its high rock traditions of court, noble family alliance, and the particular sophistication of a society that has been deeply influenced by both human and elven cultural legacies, brings its own marriage framework. Bretons like Muri and Senna and Sorine Girard are operating in a province whose cultural norms don't quite match the ones they grew up with, and adapting to that difference is part of the ongoing project of being a non-Nord in Skyrim. All of this sits underneath the game's marriage system in a way that the system itself doesn't acknowledge or address. When you put on the Amulet of Mara and a character becomes available, the game is flattening an enormous amount of cultural complexity into a single mechanical pathway. This doesn't make the marriage content less interesting. In some ways it makes it more interesting because the flat surface of the mechanic is sitting on top of a much more complicated social reality that serious engagement with the game's world reveals underneath it. Now let's spend some time on extended character analysis for 3 women whose stories the ranking format was not well suited to properly exploring. These are not necessarily the 3 highest ranked. They are the 3 whose lore threads extend outward from their immediate situations into territory that rewards more sustained attention. The first is Serana. Serana is the most famous character associated with the Dawnguard DLC, a vampire noblewoman whose story is central to the entire expansion's questline, and she is one of the most discussed characters in all of Skyrim. She's also, by design, not marriageable in the base game, and the significance of that design choice is worth examining in some depth because it speaks to something important about how the Dawnguard writers understood her character. The standard marriage system, the Amulet of Mara and the quick ceremony at the Temple of Mara would be a dramatically inappropriate mechanism for Serana. Not because she's a vampire, though the practical implications of that are their own conversation, but because her relationship with the player character, if you engage with the Dawnguard questline as it was written, rather than simply racing through it, is one of the most developed character relationships in the game. It has actual stages of development. It has moments of genuine tension. It has a history that accumulates over the course of the questline in ways that most Skyrim relationships don't, because most Skyrim relationships don't have the narrative space to accumulate anything. Serana's backstory is one of the darkest in the game when you fully engage with it. She is the daughter of Harkon, the vampire lord, whose court is the primary antagonist of the Dawnguard questline, and Valerica, who imprisoned herself in the Soul Cairn to prevent Harkon from using Serana as part of the tyranny of the Sun ritual. She was sealed in a coffin for what the game suggests was an extremely long time before the player character finds her. Coming out of that sealed sleep into the world of Skyrim's Civil War era is not an experience that the game tries to make comfortable or easy. She is disoriented by how much has changed. She has to recalibrate her understanding of a world that has moved on without her. Her parents' relationship is a wound that runs through everything she says and does. Harkon and Valerica's marriage, from the information the game provides, was at some point something other than what it became. Harkon's obsession with the tyranny of the Sun prophecy and with power consumed whatever relationship they originally had, and transformed it into something that used Serana as a pawn and eventually drove her mother to the extreme measure of self-imprisonment in the Soul Cairn, rather than allow Harkon's plans to proceed. Serana was caught in the middle of all of this, and the effect on her understanding of what relationships can become is not something the game leaves implicit. She talks about it. She has opinions about it that come from hard-won personal experience rather than philosophical position. Her reluctance to be marriageable is, one possible reading suggests, entirely characterologically consistent. She has watched what her parents' relationship became. She's been used as an instrument of someone else's ambition. She has spent an enormous amount of time sealed away from any meaningful human or vampiric connection. The idea that she would respond to a glowing amulet with immediate romantic availability would be a significant misreading of who she has established herself to be. Her reluctance to be married through the standard system is not a game design limitation, it is character writing. Various mods and later game versions have addressed this by adding a longer path to marriage with Serana that involves specific questline completion, curing her vampirism, if she's willing, and a more extended process of relationship development. Whether those modifications honour the character's established psychology is something that players debate. But the original game's decision to keep her outside the standard system is almost certainly the more honest one, in terms of what her story actually tells you about who she is. What Serana represents in the broader context of Skyrim's marriage content is a counterexample to the system's usual logic. Most of the game's marriageable wives become available through relatively modest prerequisites because the marriage system is designed to be accessible rather than narratively involved. Serana's availability, even in the versions that add it, requires engaging seriously with everything she has been through, and demonstrating through the questline's completion that you understand the weight of it. That is a meaningfully different kind of relationship than the game usually models, and it is worth understanding separately from the ranking and explanation structure that the rest of this video used. The second character worth extended discussion is Maven Blackbriar. Maven Blackbriar is not a wife. She is not marriageable. She is the most powerful civilian in Riften, the head of the Blackbriar family, and one of the more genuinely disturbing characters in the game when you take seriously what the lore establishes about her. Discussing her in the context of a video about Skyrim's wives might seem off-topic. It is not. Because understanding what Maven is tells you something important about the world that the marriageable women of Riften are navigating, and that understanding adds depth to characters like Mjol, Sharvi, Grelka, and Svanna Farshield's friend Isolde, all of whom exist in a social landscape Maven has shaped. Maven Blackbriar runs a successful meadery. She has produced children who include Hemming Blackbriar, her heir, and Ingun and Sibby, her younger children, each of whom represents a different variety of dysfunction that implies a specific kind of parental environment. She has connections to both the Thieves Guild and the Imperial faction in the Civil War, a combination that gives her leverage over almost every official power structure in Skyrim. She is not simply powerful in the way that a Jarl is powerful, through legitimate institutional authority. She is powerful in the way that someone is powerful when they have dirt on everyone around them and the demonstrated willingness to use it. The specifics of Maven's relationship with the Thieves Guild are worth examining. She is not simply a patron of the guild in the sense of being a wealthy person who funds criminal activity because it benefits her businesses. She is an active partner whose cooperation is essential enough to the guild's operations that they treat her with significantly more deference than they treat most of their outside contacts. The reasons for this go beyond the monetary. Maven provides cover, connections, and specific kinds of political protection that the guild cannot generate on its own. She is, in the guild's ecosystem, something closer to an anchor than a customer. This means that for any woman in Riften trying to build or maintain an independent economic or social life, Maven is not simply a background presence. She is a structural feature of the environment. Like weather, like geography, she is something that you account for in every decision, not because she is necessarily paying attention to you specifically, but because the systems she has built and the relationships she has cultivated extend through enough of the city's life that ignoring her is simply not possible. Mjol's ongoing campaign against the Thieves Guild is a campaign that inevitably has Maven in its periphery, even if Maven is never its direct target. When Mjol talks about cleaning up Riften, she's talking about dismantling something that Maven is deeply invested in maintaining. The fact that Maven has never apparently moved against Mjol directly is one of the game's more interesting silences. Either she doesn't consider Mjol a serious enough threat to be worth dealing with, or she has made the calculation that publicly moving against the city's most visible anti-corruption voice would create more problems than it solves, or there is some element of their relationship that the game doesn't surface. Any of those possibilities is interesting. What Maven represents for the broader picture of women's lives in Riften is complicated. She is, by the game's framing, an antagonist, someone whose power operates through fear and corruption and the crushing of anyone who interferes with her interests. But she is also a woman who has accumulated and maintained more power than almost any character in the game, regardless of gender, in a context where institutional power is typically male-dominated. The means by which she has done this are not admirable. The fact that she has done it is not nothing. Ingun Blackbriar, her younger daughter, is worth a brief mention here because she touches on themes relevant to this video's subject. Ingun has a deep and somewhat obsessive interest in alchemy, specifically in the study of poisons and their effects on living things. She's apprenticed to Elgrim at his shop in Riften, though the dynamics of that apprenticeship suggest that Ingun's interest exceeds what Elgrim is actually equipped to teach her. Her requests involve collecting alchemical components of the darker variety, and there is a quality to her enthusiasm about the effects of toxins that the game frames as somewhat unsettling. She is not marriageable, but her presence in Riften adds to the texture of what it means to be Maven's daughter, raised in a household where power, manipulation, and the calculated use of people as instruments are the operating norms. The third character worth extended discussion is Vex. Vex is a senior member of the Thieves' Guild, stationed at the Ragged Flagon in the Ratway, beneath Riften. She is not marriageable, and she is one of the characters on the list of those the game simply didn't build a marriage option for that most players wish were available. Understanding why she makes this list of extended discussions requires spending some time with what the game actually establishes about her, because she is one of the more carefully written characters in the Guild questline, even though the Guild storyline doesn't give her the same narrative centrality as, for example, Brynjolf or Mercer Fry. She is a lockpicking expert of the highest level, a master specialist in a skill that is central to the Guild's operations, and she occupies a role within the Guild hierarchy that is simultaneously important and somewhat removed from the leadership decisions that drive the questline's main action. She trains the player character in lockpicking. She gives out jobs. She has an ongoing frustration with the Guild's decline in the years preceding the questline that she expresses with a directness that is rare in an organization where maintaining ambiguous deniability is usually the preferred mode of communication. Her backstory, pieced together from dialogue fragments rather than a formal revealed history, suggests a career of accomplished guild work that preceded her current seniority. An attempt at a solo heist at some point that went wrong badly enough to still carry emotional weight years later, and a relationship with the guild that is complicated by her pride in what it used to be, and her frustration with what it has become. The heist in question, she hints at it rather than describing it directly, was ambitious enough that its failure was significant. She tried something difficult. It didn't work, and she has been operating in the Guild's institutional context since then, which is either a kind of retreat or a kind of persistence depending on how you read it. The Thieves' Guild, under Mercer Frey's leadership, is a corrupted version of itself. Mercer has been systematically stealing from the Guild's coffers for years, using his position of authority to drain the institution he is supposed to be serving. The sense among the Guild's rank and file that things are going wrong, that jobs are paying less, that opportunities are drying up, that the organization has lost some essential quality it once had, is real, and Vex articulates it more clearly than most. She has not yet figured out what is causing the decline, but she knows the decline is real, and she is not interested in pretending otherwise for the sake of institutional loyalty. There is a frustration in Vex that comes from caring about something that is being damaged by someone she has trusted, which is a specific kind of harm with a specific emotional register that the game handles with more authenticity than its usual approach to guild politics. When the betrayal is eventually revealed, the specifics of how Vex responds to it are consistent with everything that has been established about her. She is angry. She is precise about what she is angry about. She moves directly toward what needs to be done. As a portrait of professional excellence existing within a compromised institution, Vex is one of the better drawn characters in the game. That the game did not build a marriage pathway for her is a genuine missed opportunity, and the fact that many players feel this miss strongly enough to be the reason she comes up in these conversations at all is its own testament to the quality of the character work that is actually there. There is something worth saying about the overall shape of Skyrim's marriage system, now that we have spent this many hours inside it. The system, as designed, reflects a set of choices about what marriage is for within the game's architecture. It provides a domestic anchor, it generates income, it populates a home, it gives the Dragonborn, who spends most of their time engaged with apocalyptic stakes, a quiet place to return to that feels connected to ordinary life. These are functional purposes, and the system fulfills them. But the survey we've done reveals that the characters available within the system are not uniformly well served by it. Some of them, like Isla and Mjol, have enough lore depth that the marriage relationship can be understood as a meaningful development in a full and complex story. Others, like Gilfrey and Temba, have so little written around them that the marriage feels more like acquiring a useful NPC than entering a genuine relationship. The interesting question is why that gap exists, and one possible answer is that the marriage system was designed primarily as a mechanical feature rather than as a narrative one, and the writers who created individual characters did not always calibrate those characters' depth to the fact that they would eventually be plugged into this system. Characters who received significant investment for other reasons: Aela, because the companion's questline needed her; Muiri, because her Dark Brotherhood contract needed weight; Serana, because the Dawnguard questline was built around her presence, ended up being the richest marriage candidates not because the writers were thinking about marriage when they wrote them, but because those characters needed depth for the purposes they were primarily designed to serve. The characters designed primarily or only as marriage candidates, the lumber mill operators and market stall vendors and minor temple functionaries, received less investment because they were conceived as background characters who were secondarily made available for marriage rather than as complex figures who happened to also be marriageable. The difference in depth is the product of that design priority difference, and it creates the uneven landscape that this video has been mapping. The second thing worth saying is about what the player brings to these relationships. Lydia's position at rank 3 on this list is partly a function of the player's projection, the way the game creates the conditions for emotional attachment without writing much of the actual relationship. That projection is not a failure of the player. It is a feature of how narrative works in open-world games, where the player's investment fills gaps that the game doesn't close, and where the most emotionally significant relationships are often the ones where the game has given you just enough to anchor your imagination rather than spelling out every detail. The best marriages in Skyrim are probably the ones where the player has engaged with the character's questline, has understood the context of their life, has spent enough time with them as a follower to have built a sense of shared history, and has then made a deliberate and informed choice about wanting that person as a permanent part of their life within the game world. The worst marriages, experientially speaking, are the ones where the player clicks through the ceremony for mechanical benefits without any real sense of who they have married or what that person's life has been. The gap between those two experiences is a design gap, a place where a different set of choices about how deeply to develop individual characters would have produced a more uniformly compelling system, but it is also an invitation. The lore is there for many of these characters, waiting to be engaged with. The background context of their holds, their cultures, their professions, and their personal histories is all accessible if you go looking for it. And the more you go looking, the more the marriage system stops being a mechanical feature and starts being something that resembles what it is nominally supposed to represent, which is a relationship with a person who has a life. Let's spend some time on a question that comes up when you look at the full roster of marriage candidates, which is whether Skyrim's approach to the institution of marriage changed over the course of the game's development or between the base game and its major expansions. This is necessarily somewhat speculative because the decisions made in development are not all documented in ways that are publicly accessible, but the evidence inside the game itself points towards some interesting conclusions. The base game marriages cluster in certain ways that suggest the system was conceived with specific functional purposes in mind. The majority of the marriageable women in the base game are either followers, meaning the marriage was probably conceived as an extension of the follower relationship, or they are vendors in cities and towns, meaning the marriage was probably conceived as a way to give the player a built-in shopkeeper. These two categories cover the overwhelming majority of base game wives, and the system's domestic income mechanic makes most sense in the context of the vendor category. The outliers in the base game, characters like Muri and Ilya, who have significant personal backstories and questline involvement, are interesting precisely because they break the pattern. Their marriages feel different because the characters were conceived differently. They were not primarily designed as marriage candidates. They were designed as quest characters with complex emotional situations, and the marriage option was added onto characters who had already been given depth for other reasons. The Hearthfire DLC introduced the housecarl marriages for the new holds, which are mechanically identical to the existing housecarls, but add the building system's domestic context. The housecarl wives in Hearthfire, Rhea most prominently, are designed within a framework where the home is already a significant investment, a building the player has constructed and furnished and stocked. The marriage in this context has a different material meaning because the domestic space it anchors is much more substantial than the default player homes. There is something different about marrying Rhea and having her help manage a home you have personally built from the ground up versus marrying a character and having her move into a pre-existing house. The Dawnguard DLC's approach to potential marriage content is the most interesting from a design perspective. Serana, as discussed, is specifically excluded from the standard system in a way that points toward deliberate choice rather than oversight. Serene Durard, as a companion-type character whose expertise is central to the questline's progression, is handled more in the tradition of the base game's follower-to-wife pathway. The contrast between these two approaches suggests that the Dawnguard writers were thinking about marriage more carefully than the base game system usually required. The Dragonborn DLC adds Morwen and Hilland, both of whom are Solstheim characters, and both of whom have personal quests that function as prerequisites. The choice to give both Solstheim wives a specific personal errand as the unlock mechanism suggests the Dragonborn team wanted the marriage to feel slightly more earned than the default follower or vendor pathway. Whether they fully succeeded is debatable, but the intention is visible in the design. Now let's go back to a few individual characters and cover territory that the ranking format couldn't accommodate, specifically their connections to other lore threads in the game that most players don't associate with them. Isolde's connection to the Khajiit caravans, which was discussed in her section of the ranking, extends into a broader lore thread about the Khajiit's position in Skyrim's economy and culture that is worth following. The Khajiit caravans that camp outside Skyrim's cities represent one of the more interesting economic subcultures in the game. They sell goods that most city merchants don't carry, including skooma and moon sugar, the drug substances derived from the elsewhere homeland that have an enormous complicated place in Khajiit culture, and an equally complicated place in Tamriel's legal and moral landscape. Moon sugar and skooma are not simply drugs in the way the term is usually used. For Khajiit, the relationship between their people and these substances has a religious and cultural dimension that is entirely absent in how other races understand and regulate them. The two moons of Joan and Jode are central to Khajiit mythology and cosmology. The relationship between those moons and moon sugar production is understood within Khajiit culture as a sacred rather than purely chemical phenomenon. The Khajiit who use moon sugar are engaging with something that, within their own framework, connects them to their homeland, their mythology, and their identity. For the Nordic holds of Skyrim, this context is largely invisible or irrelevant. Skooma is illegal in most of Skyrim's holds. Moon sugar is heavily restricted. The Khajiit who carry and sell these substances are operating on the legal margins of a society that doesn't recognize the cultural dimensions of what they're doing and doesn't particularly want to. They are criminals by Skyrim's legal framework and practitioners of cultural tradition by their own. Isolde's interest in building a relationship with these traders, learning their practices and their goods and their methods, places her in a position of genuine cultural engagement rather than simply commercial opportunism. She is seeking out people who have knowledge that the mainstream market doesn't carry, and doing so requires treating them as sources of wisdom rather than simply as useful vendors who happen to be outside the city gates. Whether she is fully conscious of the cultural complexity she is engaging with is something the game leaves open, but the basic move of choosing the Khajiit as her trade mentors implies a willingness to learn from outsiders that not every Whiterun resident shares. The connection between Isolde and the Khajiit also touches on the civil war in an indirect way. The Khajiit caravans are permitted to operate in Skyrim under the terms of the existing political arrangement, but they are not welcomed into the cities. Their exclusion from the walled settlements reflects some of the same impulses that drive the Stormcloak movement's more explicitly ethno-nationalist elements, a sense that certain kinds of people belong inside the walls and certain kinds don't, applied more broadly than just to the civil war's immediate political stakes. Mjol's campaign against the Thieves Guild, when you follow its implications carefully, eventually runs into the question of what actually happens to Riften if the guild is removed. The guild, corrupt as it is, maintains a certain kind of order in the criminal underworld. The Ratway, Riften's underground, is controlled enough by the guild's presence that the worst kinds of violence are at least organised rather than chaotic. If the guild collapsed, the vacuum wouldn't necessarily be filled by legitimate institutions, because the legitimate institutions in Riften are themselves too compromised to step into that vacuum effectively. What might fill it instead is less organised and potentially more violent. Mjol is not unaware of this. She doesn't argue for the guild's value, but the question of what Riften actually looks like without it is something she doesn't fully engage with, and that gap in her advocacy is interesting. This connects to a broader tension in her character between idealism and pragmatism. She is idealistic in her vision of what Riften could be. She is pragmatic in her methods, her combat capability, her willingness to engage directly with dangerous people and situations. But the idealism and the pragmatism don't quite reconcile when you push them to their conclusion, because the city she is working toward cannot be simply willed into existence by removing the corruption. It requires building something in the space that removal creates, and that building project is more politically complicated than anything Mjol's individual efforts can accomplish. This is not a criticism of Mjol as a character. It is an observation about the limits of individual moral action in the face of structural problems, which is a theme that the game gestures toward throughout its treatment of Riften without ever fully articulating it. Mjol is caught in those limits, and that catching is part of what makes her interesting. Brelina Marion's house. Telvanni background, already discussed in her ranking section, connects to lore threads about what House Telvanni actually is that reward extended attention. Telvanni is the Elder Scrolls universe's clearest portrait of what extreme magical individualism looks like when organized into a social structure. Other Dunmer houses have politics, alliances, economic networks, military strength. Telvanni has mages who are powerful enough to be essentially self-sufficient, who live in towers they grow through magical means, who interact with each other through carefully managed processes of challenge and acknowledgement rather than through the more conventional political diplomacy other houses use. The result is a house that is in some ways barely a house at all, more a loose association of extremely powerful individuals who acknowledge a common identity without requiring much from each other in terms of coordination or mutual obligation. A young Telvanni mage like Brelina is in the position of being affiliated with this structure without yet having the personal power to actually participate in it on Telvanni's own terms. Telvanni mages earn their status through demonstrated power. Until you are powerful enough to command genuine respect, you are peripheral to the house's actual life. Attending the College of Winterhold, instead of the more typical Telvanni path of learning under an established master, is a statement about Brelina's situation and possibly her values. Either she didn't have access to the master-apprentice pathway within Telvanni, which could reflect her family's specific circumstances, or the disruption caused by Morrowind's catastrophes, or she chose the college because it offered something she valued that Telvanni's model didn't. The college is, notably, a much more collaborative and communal institution than anything House Telvanni would organise. Knowledge is shared and built upon in common, rather than hoarded and defended. This is antithetical to the Telvanni way. That Brelina is here rather than there suggests something about her relationship to her house's values that the game only begins to explore. Isla's connection to Hircine, the Daedric prince of the hunt, deserves more attention than the ranking section could give it. Lycanthropy in the Elder Scrolls universe is specifically Hircine's domain. He created the condition. He sustains it. The beast blood is, in the theological framework of the Elder Scrolls, a gift of his specific variety of Daedric blessing, and the consequences for the soul that the Companion's lore describes, specifically that werewolves who die go to Hircine's hunting grounds rather than to Sovngarde, are Hircine's claim on his creations rather than a neutral consequence of the condition. This means that Ayala's choice to keep the beast blood is, in theological terms, a choice about where she goes when she dies. It is a choice to be Hircine's permanently. The hunting grounds of Hircine's realm are described in various Elder Scrolls sources as an eternal hunt, which for a warrior whose entire identity is built around hunting, and the chase is a specific kind of afterlife, rather than simply a generic non-Sovngarde option. Some readings of the lore suggest that Hircine's hunting grounds are not punishment for the lycanthropes who end up there, but rather appropriate for them, the continuation of what they already were, rather than the deprivation of something they wanted. Ayala's acceptance of this future, her conscious choice to remain what she's knowing where it leads, is one of the more interesting theological commitments any character in the game makes. She has looked at the two ways, Sovngarde and the hunting grounds, and decided that the hunting grounds are not the worse option. That judgment says something about what she values in life and what she expects to value after it. For someone who has spent her life as a hunter, the idea of an eternal hunt might genuinely be more appealing than the feasting hall of heroes, however honoured that destination is in her culture. When you marry Ayala, you are marrying someone who has made this specific theological choice. She belongs to Hircine in a sense that carries genuine metaphysical weight within the world's own terms. What that means for the Dragonborn, whose own fate is potentially quite different, is a question the game doesn't address but that the lore raises if you take the implications seriously. They are, in some sense, building a life together across a theological boundary. She will go to the hunt. The Dragonborn's fate is considerably more complicated and considerably less settled. The marriage is real, and the love, such as the game models it, is real. And underneath it is a permanent divergence that neither of them can change or undo. That is, if you take the lore seriously, one of the more genuinely poignant dimensions of any marriage in the game. One last thing before this video ends, which is about the experience of playing Skyrim with a spouse over many hours and what that reveals about the game's architecture more broadly. Skyrim is, in its core design philosophy, a game about solitude as much as it is a game about adventure. The Dragonborn is a singular figure. The quests that matter most are ones that only the Dragonborn can complete. The dragons respond to you and not to anyone else. You are the only person who can absorb a dragon's soul. The entire narrative structure of the game exists to tell you that you are specifically necessary in a way that no one else is. The marriage system sits somewhat awkwardly in relation to this structure. It introduces a permanence and a domesticity that the rest of the game's design isn't really built to accommodate. The house you come home to is not fully integrated into the quests you do. The spouse you return to doesn't know about the dragon you just killed, or the ancient tomb you just explored, or the civil war battle you just survived. The marriage exists in a parallel register to the adventure, touching it at the edges without being woven into it. This disconnect could be seen as a design failure, and in some respects it is. The emotional richness of what it means to maintain a committed relationship with another person while also carrying the weight of being the person who has to save the world is a narrative territory that Skyrim's structure doesn't have the tools to explore. The game can give you a person to come home to. It can give them some warm dialogue and a functional shop and a willingness to cook for you. What it cannot do within its own architecture is make the marriage feel fully real, in the sense of having the person understand what you have been doing and why it matters, and what it has cost you. But here is the thing, the disconnect itself becomes meaningful if you engage with it, rather than treating it as a gap to be ignored. You are the Dragonborn. You are carrying something that no one else in the world can carry with you. And at the end of the day, or the end of the dungeon, or the end of whatever crisis has required your specific impossible intervention, you go home to someone who is there, who is present, who has kept a life running while you are away doing the things that only you can do. They can't share the extraordinary parts. They are present for the ordinary ones. That, in its own quiet way, is not nothing. Continue from where you left off no matter what. 950p orchestrated narrative continuation for extended script project, orchestrated narrative continuation for extended script project, and that ordinary presence, when you have spent enough hours in Skyrim to understand how rare it actually is, starts to look less like a consolation prize and more like the point. Most of what the Dragonborn touches in the world is temporary, in a specific way. You clear a bandit camp and the bandits eventually respawn. You save a city from a dragon and the city goes back to its daily business, as if the dragon was a weather event rather than an extinction-level threat. You resolve a quest line that has been building toward catastrophe for years, and the people who asked you to resolve it go back to standing in the same spot they were standing in before. The world of Skyrim has a way of absorbing what you do into itself and continuing on without registering the full weight of what just happened. The marriage is different. It persists. The person you chose is in your home every time you return, which means every time you return, there is evidence that something you did had a consequence that didn't evaporate. You chose someone. They are still there. The world may have moved on from the dragon and the Forsworn and the Dwemer ruin, but the person in your home is the product of a decision that the game has held constant. That constancy is, within Skyrim's broader architecture of impermanence, genuinely unusual. This is worth taking seriously as a design element, even if it wasn't entirely intentional. The marriage system may have been conceived primarily as a domestic utility feature. The income generation, the cooking, the follower functionality, but the effect it produces at the level of emotional experience is something more than the sum of those functions. It produces a relationship that is the one stable thing in a world designed to keep moving. Let's go back into the lore one more time, specifically to the books and texts that exist within Skyrim's world, and that address love, marriage, and relationships from inside the game's own cultural perspective. Because these texts are part of the world building that most players walk past without reading, and they add considerably to the picture of what the institution of marriage means in the context this video has been exploring. The Elder Scrolls series has a long tradition of including in-world texts that range from the mundane to the philosophically complex, and several of them are directly relevant to the themes this video has covered. The Song of Hrormir, an ancient Nordic poem, gives some sense of how romantic heroism was conceived in the older layers of Nord culture. The poem involves Hrormir, a powerful warrior, and his entanglement with forces considerably larger than himself. And while its direct subject is not marriage, the way it handles the relationship between strength and devotion points toward the values the culture has organized around those concepts. The books about Mara specifically are worth attention. Mara's place in the Nine Divines, which is available in the game's library of readable books, establishes that Mara was originally worshipped in the earliest periods of Tamrielic religion as a fertility goddess rather than specifically as a goddess of love. The love aspect developed over time as the religion was systematized by imperial culture, and the current form of the faith, with its emphasis on compassion and family, is a relatively recent development when set against the full timeline of worship. This historical note matters because it means the wedding ceremony the player participates in at the Temple of Mara is part of a religious tradition that has itself evolved significantly over time. The Mara the ancient Nords worshipped for agricultural fertility is not quite the same entity as the Mara whose priests now officiate at weddings in Riften. The institution has accumulated layers, the meaning has shifted, and the marriage system the game presents as a simple unified thing is actually the contemporary expression of a much longer and more complicated religious history. The Argonian book, the Tsayeshi creation myth, is not about love, but about origins, and it represents the kind of cross-cultural lore text that the game peppers through its bookshelves to remind you that the world is wider than the province you're currently walking through. Finding it in a bookshelf in Skyrim, a province that is in many ways a cultural opposite of Black Marsh, is a small reminder that the world of Tamriel contains multitudes that the primary setting of any given game can only gesture toward. The text that is perhaps most directly relevant to this video's subject is Nightfall, a short story that can be found in various locations throughout the game. It concerns a knight and a woman he loves, and the misunderstandings and distance that war and duty create between them. It is not great literature by any external standard, but within the game's world, it is a piece of popular fiction that reflects back the emotional realities of people in a world where adventure and military service regularly separate partners, and where the ordinary domestic life that love is supposed to sustain can be disrupted or destroyed by the extraordinary demands the world makes on certain people. The parallels to the Dragonborn situation are not subtle. You are reading, within the game, a story about someone in a version of your situation, the knight who must leave the person he loves to go do the thing that is required of him. The question of whether that person will be there when he returns. The question of whether returning changes anything, or whether the leaving has already done damage that completion cannot repair. These themes are ones that the game handles through its marriage system in a more mechanical way, but the presence of texts like Nightfall suggests that the writers were aware of the emotional territory they were building around, even if the system itself couldn't fully explore it. Let's talk about the economic dimension of marriage, because the shop function that most wives take on after marriage is not simply a convenience mechanic. It sits within a broader economic reality in Skyrim that has its own lore depth, an understanding that reality changes how you think about what the spouse is doing when you're away. Skyrim's economy, as presented in the game, is a mixed system. There are large commercial interests, the Blackbriar Meadery, the East Empire Trading Company operations, the Silverblood family's mining and real estate holdings. There are mid-size operations, the Riverwood Trader, the various city-based merchants who have established businesses in the market districts. And there are small independent operators, the market stall vendors, the travelling traders, the people who are making a living in the interstices of the larger economic structures. When a wife sets up a shop in the player's home, she is operating in this last category. She is an independent small vendor working out of a residential space, which is exactly the kind of marginal commercial operation that characterizes the most vulnerable part of any pre-industrial economy. She has no guild protection. She has no political patron. She is selling goods out of a home that is located in a specific hold with specific tax arrangements and specific relationships to the local power structures. The income she generates, the small amount of gold she provides each day, is not simply a game mechanic. Within the world's own logic, it represents the ongoing commercial effort of someone who is running a genuine business under genuinely uncertain conditions. If you are away for a long time, she is continuing to operate that business. She is dealing with suppliers. She is managing whatever local relationships are necessary to keep things running. She is doing this while also maintaining the household, which in Skyrim's world is a more labour-intensive undertaking than it would be in a modern context. The specific goods your spouse sells tend to reflect their background and expertise. Isla, if she sets up a shop, sells hunting and wilderness-related goods. Borelina tends toward magical supplies. Isolde brings her commercial sensibility to general merchandise. These are not random assignments. They reflect who these people were before the marriage and what kind of knowledge they bring to the operation. The shop is, in its small way, a continuation of identity rather than an abandonment of it. There is something worth noticing in the fact that almost every wife in the game takes on this role. It is not presented as the only option, not explicitly, but it is what happens by default in almost every case. The domestic economy is organised around the wife running a business, while the husband adventurers, which reflects the game's design assumptions in ways that are interesting to be aware of, even if you are choosing to play the system differently. The writers were working within a model of household economics that, whether consciously or not, reflects specific assumptions about how domestic labour and commercial activity are distributed. Let's revisit a few of the characters who appeared early in the ranking and give them a bit more development, because the format of the ranked list sometimes moves too quickly past characters at the lower end who actually have things worth saying about them. Grelka's specific skill set, the light armor training, connects her to a broader tradition in Skyrim's economy of independent trainers who operate outside institutional frameworks. The companions train their own members, the college trains its own students, but there are independent trainers throughout Skyrim who operate on a purely commercial basis, offering their expertise to whoever can pay for it. These people are the private tutors of a pre-institutional world, filling gaps left by the fact that most people who need specific skills don't have access to the organizations that would teach them. Grelka's position as a light armor trainer in Riften's open market means she is in this independent category. She is not affiliated with the Companions or any other warrior organization. She is selling expertise directly to the public. That expertise has to be maintained. She has to stay sharp enough that the training she offers is worth the fee. This means she's not simply a former practitioner who has retired into instruction. She is someone whose skills are current, actively maintained, which implies ongoing practice that the market stall existence doesn't obviously accommodate. What does she do to stay current? Where does she train? The game doesn't say, and the gap is interesting. Camilla Valerius and her brother Lucan represent one of the more interesting small business portraits in the game. The Riverwood Trader is a family operation, which means it has a specific social structure, the dynamics of siblings running a business together that comes with its own complications. The Sven Fjendal rivalry for Camilla's attention exists in the context of a life where her primary relationship is not romantic at all, but professional and familial. Her brother is her business partner. The shop is her daily environment. Whatever romantic interest either man is pursuing, Camilla is living a life that is primarily organized around work and family rather than around romantic possibility. This context gives the Golden Claw quest a slightly different texture. The theft Lucan is upset about is not simply a crime against property. It is a crime against the business, which is the center of both his and Camilla's livelihood and daily existence. The recovered claw restores something that matters to both of them in ways that extend beyond its market value, and Camilla's role in the quest as a potential guide to Bleak Falls Barrow and as the somewhat passive object of the romantic competition running in parallel sits alongside this more central concern about the shop's integrity. Enjada Stonearm's position within the companions, which was touched on in her ranking section, connects to a theme that runs through several of the marriage candidates who are associated with the companions. The organisation has an inner circle and an outer membership, and the relationship between these two groups carries a specific tension. The outer members know that the circle has something they don't, some additional level of trust and presumably some additional knowledge or capability that the organisation considers too significant to share until a higher threshold of trust has been established. For Njada, who is clearly capable, and who knows she is capable, being in the outer membership while the circle maintains its secrets is a position that probably generates more internal friction than her dialogue surface level indicates. The companion's questline reveals what the circle's secret actually is, which is the beast blood, the lycanthropy that Ayla and the other circle members share. This secret, when you understand it, recontextualizes the entire social structure of the organization. The circle is not simply the senior staff in an institutional hierarchy. They are people who share a transformation that changes their fundamental nature. The oath of the circle is not simply an oath of senior responsibility. It is an oath bound to a specific kind of shared identity that sets them apart, not just organizationally, but ontologically. Njada is not part of this. She is a skilled warrior who is a member of the organization in the ordinary sense, but who does not have access to what the circle actually shares. If she ever learned what the secret was, the question of how she would respond to that information is one that the game never addresses, because the questline moves past her. Would she want it? Would she be troubled by it? Would it change how she understood her own position within the organization? These are genuinely interesting questions that the game raises without answering. The question of aging and time in Skyrim's world is worth spending a few minutes on, because it is relevant to every marriage in the game in a way that the game itself almost never addresses. Skyrim's NPCs do not age. They are fixed at the age they appear to be when you meet them. The Jarl's children are always the same age. The innkeepers are always the same age. The wife you marry on the first day of your playthrough and the wife you marry after 1,000 hours of gameplay are both going to look exactly the same as the day you met them for as long as the game runs. This is an obvious practical constraint of game development. Modelling aging would require enormous additional resources and would create continuity problems the game isn't designed to handle. But within the world's own logic, time does pass. The Civil War has an end point. The Dragon Crisis has an end point. The various quest lines move through time, even if the NPCs inhabiting them don't age accordingly. And the Dragonborn, who is presumably mortal unless the game's lore suggests otherwise for specific reasons, is also, presumably, aging even if the character model doesn't reflect it. The more interesting lore consideration is whether the Dragonborn might actually be immortal, or at least significantly longer lived as a consequence of what they are. Dragons in Skyrim are effectively immortal in the absence of someone absorbing their soul. The dragon soul is what gives them their permanence. The Dragonborn, who absorbs dragon souls, is in some sense accumulating something that dragons cannot simply regenerate. Whether this absorption has any effect on the Dragonborn's own lifespan is a question the game deliberately leaves open, and different players and lore scholars have different interpretations. If the Dragonborn has some form of extended lifespan as a consequence of their nature, the marriages in the game take on a different long-term character. Most of the marriage candidates are mortal humans or near-humans with ordinary human lifespans. Aela, who is a werewolf, has her own complicated relationship with mortality, given Hircine's claim on her soul. Serana, who is a vampire, is effectively immortal, barring violent death. Most of the others are simply people who will age and die within a human time frame. A marriage to Mjol or Isolde or Sylgia, if the Dragonborn is genuinely longer lived than those characters, is a marriage with an endpoint that the Dragonborn will survive. That is a specific kind of relationship dynamic, one that brings its own grief and its own questions about attachment, that the game doesn't address because addressing it would require the aging mechanic the game isn't built to support. But the lore territory is there, and sitting with it changes the emotional texture of the marriage choices in ways that the game's cheerful domestic presentation doesn't acknowledge. Let's spend some time with the geography of marriage in Skyrim, which is to say, the question of where these women come from and what their specific geographic origins say about their characters in ways that have not yet been fully explored. Skyrim is divided into 9 holds, each with its own geographic character, political situation, and cultural emphasis. The distribution of marriageable women across those holds is not even, and the imbalances are interesting. Riften, in the Rift, contributes more potential wives than any other single location. Isolde is from Whiterun, but she is one of the few Whiterun-based wives. Riften gives you Mjol, Shavi, and through the connection to the Temple of Mara, the organisational backbone of the whole marriage system. This clustering of marriage content in Riften is probably a function of the city's narrative density in the base game. Riften is one of the most plot-active cities, hosting the Thieves' Guild questline, the Blackbriar political content, the Temple of Mara, and the general social complexity that comes from a city where corruption is the operating system. That narrative density created more interesting NPCs, and more interesting NPCs created more marriage candidates. Markarth contributes Orla, Senna, and Muri, all of whom are tied to specific Markarth institutions. The Temple of Dibella and the Hag's Cure are both Markarth institutions, and both of them are interesting enough to generate characters worth marrying. The city's architectural and political character, the ancient Dwemer bones beneath the modern Nord city, the forsworn presence in the surrounding reach, the Silverblood family's grip on official power, all of it creates a pressure that shapes the people living within it in ways that make them more interesting than citizens of a more stable city. Windhelm contributes Shavi, who as an Argonian lives outside its walls, and through extension, its influence on the Grey Quarter and the cultural climate that shapes every non-Nord character in the northeastern part of the province. The city itself is one of the most lore-dense locations in the game, the ancient capital of the Nords, the seat of Ulfric's Stormcloak, the location of some of the base game's most uncomfortable political content. That it produces relatively few marriage candidates, despite its law richness, is partly a function of its political orientation, which favours Nord characters, and partly a function of the city's social atmosphere, which is not particularly welcoming to the outsider characters, who often end up as marriage candidates. Solitude, the imperial capital, contributes Tari from radiant raiment and Jordis the sword maiden as the Harfingar housecarl. The city's political centrality and commercial sophistication shape both of these characters in ways that distinguish them from wives associated with smaller or more peripheral holds. Solitude is Skyrim's most outward-facing city, the one most connected to the Empire and to the wider currents of Tamrielic politics and culture, and the women who come from it carry that outward-facing quality. The smaller holds, the Pale with its capital Dawnstar, Jarlmarch with Morthul, Falkreath with its quiet pine forests, contribute fewer marriage candidates. This is consistent with the general design logic of smaller holds having less narrative investment overall, but the geographic characters of these holds are genuinely distinct and worth noting, because the wives who do come from them, like the Hearthfire housecarls associated with those holds' homesteads, carry those geographic flavours in ways that differentiate them from the more urban-influenced characters of Riften and Markarth and Solitude. Let's talk about what happens in Skyrim when the Dragonborn dies from a marriage perspective. This is a morbid corner of the lore, but it is relevant. When the Dragonborn dies and reloads from a save, the game presents this as a form of narrative non-event, a reset rather than a death. But within the world's own logic, if you take the fiction seriously, the Dragonborn is dying repeatedly throughout the course of a playthrough, and something is either resetting or the deaths are not actually final. In some way the lore doesn't fully account for a spouse who is present in the home while all of this is happening, the implications are uncomfortable. If the Dragonborn walks out the door and doesn't come back, the spouse has no way of knowing whether this is the start of a long absence or a permanent one. The game doesn't model this because it doesn't need to, but the spouses who are written as genuinely caring about the Dragonborn's well-being, Aila, Mjol, Sirana, in the modified versions, are implicitly living with a specific form of uncertainty that the game doesn't acknowledge. This uncertainty is consistent with what spouses of people in dangerous professions actually experience in the real world. The soldier's family, the miner's family, the firefighter's family. Anyone whose partner regularly goes into situations where not coming back is a real possibility, lives with a specific kind of background anxiety that becomes the texture of daily life, rather than an acute crisis. They function, they maintain the household, they keep going. And they wait, in some part of their awareness, for the return they hope will keep coming. The game's spouses who say they worry about you when you're away are, within this reading, expressing something more than a dialogue tree pleasantry. They are expressing the genuine and rational concern of someone who has watched you walk out the door towards situations that have a non-trivial probability of killing you. That the game then models your return from death as a simple reload is a mechanical convenience that sits over a much more emotionally significant piece of the fiction if you let yourself actually think about it. The question of children in Skyrim's marriage system is one that Hearthfire adds in a limited form, allowing the player to adopt children rather than have biological children with their spouse. This choice, adoption over biology, was probably made for practical reasons of development complexity. But within the world's own terms, it creates an interesting portrait of a specific kind of family formation. The children available for adoption in Skyrim are, without exception, children who have lost their parents or their homes through some form of tragedy. They are orphans in the formal institutional sense, living at Honor Hall Orphanage in Riften, or they are street children living rough in one of the cities without family support. Adopting one of these children is, in the world's terms, taking in someone who would otherwise be without a family, which is a different act from having a biological child. It is a chosen family rather than a blood family, and the game treats it with enough warmth that the distinction feels meaningful rather than incidental. Honor Hall Orphanage in Riften, the source of many adoptable children, is itself a piece of Riften's complicated social landscape. It is run by Grelod the Kind, whose name is one of the game's more pointed ironies. Grelod is not kind. She treats the children in her care with a severity that verges on cruelty, forbidding them to look forward to adoption while maintaining an institution that is supposed to give them access to it. The Dark Brotherhood questline involves her assassination, which is presented as one of the less morally troubling kills in that questline's roster precisely because of how she treats the children. What this means for the children you adopt from Honor Hall specifically is that they have been living in an environment defined by authoritarian cruelty and the systematic denial of hope. When they come to live with the Dragonborn, they are coming from somewhere genuinely bad into something that the game presents as genuinely better. The warmth of the domestic life the game models after adoption is not just pleasant background. For these specific children, it is a significant change from the only home they have known. The Hearthfire homes themselves, which the player builds rather than purchases, create a specific domestic environment that distinguishes them from the default player homes available in the base game. Building a home from the ground up, choosing the layout, furnishing it with materials you've gathered, means the space has a different relationship to the player's agency than a pre-existing structure. The home is something you made rather than something you moved into, and that act of making is part of the domestic life the expansion is trying to build. The relationship between the home you build and the wife who manages it, and the children who live in it, constitutes the most complete portrait of ordinary life that Skyrim's design ever attempts. It is still schematic. It is still much thinner than a fully realized domestic narrative would be, but within its limits it does something genuine. It creates a home that feels inhabited rather than simply functional, and the people in it feel, in their limited scripted way, like they belong there. Let's return once more to the broader world of Tamriel and what it tells us about relationships across cultures, because this context shapes several of the marriage candidates in ways worth revisiting through a slightly different lens. The Bretons of High Rock, who contribute Muiri, Senna, Serene Gerard, and Tari to the marriage pool, come from a culture that is itself a hybrid, the product of centuries of interaction and intermarriage between the Aldmer elves who came to Tamriel's northwest and the ancient human inhabitants they encountered there. The Bretons are, in their genetic makeup, the most fully integrated of Tamriel's major human cultures, carrying actual elven heritage in their bloodlines in ways that the Nords and Imperials and Redguard don't. Their characteristic affinity for magic is the most visible expression of that heritage. What this means culturally is that Bretons have always been a people defined by mixing rather than by purity, by the product of contact between different traditions, rather than by the preservation of a single, unbroken line. Their cultural sophistication is partly the product of that mixing, the way that contact between different ways of thinking tends to generate more complex intellectual and artistic output than isolation does. Their political landscape in High Rock, with its multiplicity of petty kingdoms and noble families, all navigating complex alliance systems, is also partly the product of a culture where identity has always been less fixed than in more ethnically homogeneous regions. Breton women in Skyrim are, in this reading, people from a culture that has always known how to negotiate between different worlds. They are comfortable with complexity. They are comfortable with the idea that one's identity might be several things simultaneously rather than a single pure thing. Muiri is a woman who has experienced betrayal, but who has also been capable of genuine trust, who has taken violent action, but who has also genuine warmth, and both of those things can be true simultaneously. Senna is a priestess of a foreign faith living in an ancient Dwemer city in a Nordic province, comfortable in a situation that combines multiple cultural registers. Serene is a Breton engineer obsessed with Dwemer technology, which is itself a form of trying to understand something deeply alien to her background. The Altmer, represented on this list by Tari, come from the opposite cultural tradition in a meaningful sense. The Altmer, the High Elves of the Somerset Isles, are a culture that has defined itself through preservation of what they consider the original elven heritage, the Aldmer legacy that the various elven cultures of Tamriel have, in their view, debased by mixing with humans and other races. The Thalmor's political project is partly about restoring what the Altmer see as their original purity and dominance. The cultural arrogance that the Altmer are known for is inseparable from this historical project of self-definition through superiority. Tari operates within this cultural framework, which means her standards and her aesthetic confidence and her willingness to make you feel like you don't quite measure up are not just personality traits. They are the individual expression of a cultural tradition that has organized itself around the idea that excellence and refinement are the defining characteristics of Altmer identity. When she critiques your clothing, she is performing, in miniature, what her culture does on a civilizational scale. She is applying a standard and noting where you fall short of it. The fact that she is in solitude running a clothing shop, rather than in the Somerset Isles surrounded by other Altmer, is interesting precisely because it means she is applying Altmer standards in a context where Altmer dominance is not assumed. She cannot rely on the cultural authority her standards draw from. She has to convince people in a foreign province that those standards actually matter. And apparently, she has done this successfully enough to run a profitable business, which implies that the sophistication she offers has real value in the solitude marketplace, even for people who don't share her cultural background. One thing this video has not addressed explicitly, but which has been present implicitly throughout, is the question of what it means to love someone in a world with active Daedric princes. The Daedric princes are real in Skyrim's world. They are not myths or religions built around metaphor. They are actual entities of enormous power who intervene actively in the lives of mortals, who make deals and issue commands, and whose realms of oblivion are accessible through specific means. Mara, the divine of love, who presides over the marriage ceremonies in this game, is also a real entity in this world's cosmology, though the relationship between divines and Daedric princes is complex and contested within the lore. What this means for love as an experience in Skyrim's world is that it is not simply a matter of two people and the feelings between them. It is a matter of two people and the feelings between them within a cosmos that has actual gods who have actual stakes in how those feelings develop and what they produce. Mara's interest in love is not purely passive. Her faith sustains something that she actively blesses or withholds blessing from. The wedding ceremony at her temple is not just a social ritual, it is an invocation of a genuine divine presence whose attention is, according to the faith, actually given to the union being formed. Hircine's interest in Aela, as discussed, gives her marriage a specific divine dimension that most of the other marriages don't have. Aela belongs to Hircine in a way that is not metaphorical. Her soul is, by the terms of the beast blood she has chosen to keep, promised to his hunting grounds. Marrying her means forming a bond with someone who is already, in a real cosmological sense, claimed. The Daedric princes, whose domains include deception, manipulation, and the subversion of ordinary life, Boethia, Nocturnal, Mehrunes Dagon, are all active presences in the world that the marriageable women of Skyrim are navigating. The Thieves Guild's relationship with Nocturnal, the Shadow of Doubt, is one of the more elaborated examples of this in the game. Brynjolf, Mercer Frey, Carlia, all of them operate under a sworn relationship to Nocturnal that has specific terms and specific consequences. The women connected to the guild, including Vex, who was discussed in the extended analysis section, are all operating in a context shaped by this divine relationship, whether or not they personally have made any vow to Nocturnal. Muiri's involvement with the Dark Brotherhood touches on Sithis and the Night Mother, the Void and its mortal vessel, which are among the more philosophically unusual elements in Skyrim's cosmological landscape. The Dark Brotherhood does not worship a Daedric prince. It worships Sithis, who is not a Daedric prince in the conventional sense, but rather something closer to the void that preceded existence, a fundamental negation that is, in some readings, the source from which even the Daedric princes emerged. Muiri commissioning a contract with this organization has connected her, even in the limited way of a client relationship, to this specific spiritual current. All of this sits beneath the relatively cheerful surface of the marriage system without the game making it explicit. The women you can marry are living in a world where the divine is genuinely present and genuinely active, and the choices they make, including the choice to marry the Dragonborn, exist within that context. Some of them are more directly shaped by it than others, but none of them are simply secular actors in a world where the metaphysical is merely symbolic. Let's take one more extended look at a character who has appeared briefly throughout this video, but who deserves a more complete treatment, and that character is Carlia. Carlia is not marriageable. She is one of the central figures of the Thieves Guild questline, a Dunmer woman who has been living in exile for years after being falsely accused of murdering Gallus, the previous guildmaster. She has spent that exile in preparation for the return she knew she would eventually make, studying the Nightingale Oath and its implications, maintaining a connection to Nocturnal through the devotional practices her exile allowed, and waiting for the moment when she could bring down Mercer Frey, the man who actually killed Gallus and framed her for it. The Nightingale arc, which involves the player Brynjolf and Carlia becoming sworn Nightingales in service to Nocturnal, is one of the Thieves Guild questline's more dramatically successful elements. The ceremony, the Ebonmere, Nocturnal's specific nature as a Daedric prince of shadows, and the night, the specific terms of the Nightingale Oath and what it means for the souls of those who take it. All of this creates a ritual context that gives the questline a weight that the purely criminal elements don't quite generate on their own. Carlia's relationship with Gallus is the emotional heart of her story. The game presents it as a genuine and deep love, one that preceded the Nightingale Oath, and that Mercer's betrayal destroyed along with everything else. She has spent years holding on to the memory of someone she loved who was killed by a man she trusted. That specific combination of grief and betrayal is one that the game handles with restraint, showing it through the specificity of her actions rather than through explicit emotional processing. She is methodical, she is patient. She has been patient for an extraordinary amount of time, and the patience is not cold, it is warm patience, the kind that comes from caring deeply about the outcome, rather than from detachment. Her exile in Nightingale Hall, the sanctuary associated with the Nightingale tradition, gives her a specific kind of solitude that is different from the solitude of characters like Gilfrey in their geographic isolation. Carlia chose her exile. She chose to stay in one place and prepare, rather than to fight her way back immediately, or to disappear entirely. The choice to be patient when patience was the right strategy is its own form of discipline. Why isn't she marriageable? The game probably didn't build the pathway for the same reasons Serana wasn't originally marriageable in the base game. She is too central to her questline's emotional architecture to be accessed through the standard system without it feeling reductive. The Amulet of Mara and the brief ceremony at the Temple of Mara doesn't scale to the depth of what Carlia's story actually is. If you engaged seriously with the Thieves Guild questline and understood what she's been through, the idea of clicking through a marriage ceremony with her would feel like a category error. That said, the loss of the potential is real. Carlia is one of the most fully realized characters in the game. Her grief is genuine, her patience and her strategic intelligence, and her specific devotion to Nocturnal's tradition are all coherently developed. She has been through something that has required everything she has, and she has come out the other side of it without losing herself. That is a portrait of a person worth knowing, and the marriage system's inability to honour that portrait is the same kind of loss as the game's treatment of Serana. The final extended character discussion is Valerica,